The story begins with how a young girl named Opilia rushed like a fury past the servants and, opening the door, flew into the Duke's office. He raised his eyes and looked at his wife. The young man said with displeasure that Opilia had not even tried to knock on the door and expressed the opinion that she must not have learned good manners after all. His gaze pierced the girl through and through. The young girl was incredibly beautiful. When the Duke asked why she had come at such a late hour, Opilia replied that she urgently needed to say something important. The girl timidly began to say that she demanded a divorce from him, but before she could prove her sentence to the end, he rudely interrupted her and told her to leave his office immediately. Opilia tried to reach him and told him to just listen to her at least once to the end, asking if it was so difficult to do, but the Duke did not even want to hear anything. The Duke looked at Opilia with such a piercing look that she was even afraid. The girl decided not to continue the conversation, so as not to run into trouble, so she hurried to leave the room. Having already closed the door, the girl thought that she had never guessed that divorce is such a difficult task. And when she thought about how many times the Duke had refused her this, she felt uneasy. The Countess's Guide to Remarriage was the name of a typical melodrama. There was also nothing extraordinary in the plot of this book. The main character was a pretty countess. Once, while walking along the forest paths of her estate, the Countess saw a young man who had lost consciousness and gave him first aid. She took him to her estate so that the boy could recover his strength. As it turned out, this young man was a long-lost prince. It was during his stay at the Countess's estate that the young man's memory returned and he remembered his aristocratic status. Very soon the young man regained the status of a prince and, without thinking for a long time, made an offer to the Countess, because during his stay in her estate he fell madly in love with a young girl. For a young girl, this novel about a countess and a young prince was a real escape and salvation from psychological problems and hospital food. The girl was currently undergoing treatment, but the girl especially liked the character of Opilia McGuffey, the only daughter of the ducal family of the empire, who was known for her beauty far beyond the borders of her homeland. The girl read about her with particular zeal. But despite her incredible beauty, Opilia was so cruel that there were legends about her. She could slap not only an aristocrat, but also beat to death any of the servants. The girl's father, who was trapped, decided to hasten the marriage and gave his only daughter to the Grand Duke Rezin, whom Opilia hated with all her being. Her husband turned out to be Sylvester Rezin, who was half human, half demon, and possessed demonic blood. He was the only one who could accept the thief Opilia as she is. Sylvester was attracted by the connections and power of the ducal family, so against Ophilia's will, the marriage still took place. It was a formal ceremony without any pomp, as expected by aristocratic circles. After the marriage, Ophilia's father, who lost all his fortune in gambling, was in great debt. Fortunately, Opilia was released from her father's debts because she married Sylvester Rezin. Duke McGuffey, constantly hounded by creditors, eventually committed suicide. It was from that moment that Opilia began to study dark magic. Closing her eyes to everything, Opilia spent several years in a stupor. But one day the girl returned to reality because she fell in love with the crown prince at first sight. This young man's name was Kalian von Tweedy. This was the same prince who was officially recognized only after 16 years of his absence, and who was saved by the countess from starvation. Having met Kalian's eyes, Opilia seemed to be reborn into the world and wanted to get this young man as her husband at any cost. Ophilia's love became something of an obsession, and she attacked, kidnapped, and committed other beastly acts that were hard to put into words with anyone who came more than a step closer to the prince. The crown prince was simply enraged by all of Ophilia's misdeeds, but felt helpless to fight it somehow. He could not believe that a young girl was capable of such cruel acts. But as soon as the crown prince wanted to punish Opilia for such behavior, her husband, the Duke of Rezin, immediately settled all the problems, and the young girl was left without orders. Sylvester Rezin was the most influential man in the empire, and it was he who constantly competed with the hereditary principle for power. The Duke could manipulate all representatives of aristocratic society. In the end, the crown prince dared to take concrete actions and ordered Opilia to prove her true love to the crown prince and kill her husband, Sylvester Rezin. Opilia did not hesitate for a moment, and with the help of her dark magic, absorbed all the magical power of Sylvester Rezin. As a result, the young man died a painful death 4 days later. But the price of proof of Ophilia's love was not the mutual love of the crown prince, but a sentence of death by hanging. And so ended the life of the most beautiful girl in the empire. The path of infidelity connected these four people who were discussed in the girl's favorite novel. Two of them received blessings and were awarded the titles of main heroes. And your other heroes of the novel met their end, like the last thieves. The girl, reading this novel, was upset that Opilia was executed and fell asleep with a heavy stone on her heart. And when the girl woke up, she realized that she was in Ophilia's body and was lying on the dirty, cold ground under the pouring rain. The girl realized that she had fallen into this damned affair. And although it was complete madness, no matter how the girl tried to close and open her eyes, she was still in Ophilia's body and could not do anything about it. So she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The young girl admitted that despite everything Opilia had to endure, she remained as beautiful as always. It remained only to understand at what point in the novel the girl got here. After spending a few days in the Duke's estate, she realized that fortunately Sylvester Resin was still alive, and therefore there was still a lot of time before her execution. But unfortunately, Opilia had already met the crown prince and fell in love with him, so there was not much time before her end, and the girl decided to do something about it. The girl realized that she got there exactly at the moment when Opilia began to torment the heroine Flur, so that she would get rid of the crown prince and he would go to Opilia only. Opilia not only humiliated Flur in the eyes of the entire aristocratic community, but also destroyed her husband's business in a flash, and even tried to sell poor Flur into slavery. Before, of course, Opilia was not so cruel, but one incident completely forced the young girl to fly off the rails and allow herself to do incomprehensible things. It happened after that incident, namely during the conversation with her father, when she demanded that he not pass him off as her for the northern ruler, because he was a real demon. But the father absolutely could not understand that his daughter did not like Sylvester, because an evil woman and a demon are just an ideal couple, so he was only for their marriage as soon as possible. This was Ophilia's last conversation with her parents. Only after learning about his death, the girl disappeared from the Duke's estate for a while, and then unexpectedly appeared in Sylvester Resin's dungeon. As soon as the Duke was informed that his wife had been found, he immediately flew to the dungeon. But what he saw was not for the faint of heart, and even his hair stood on end. In front of the man stood the crazy Opilia, who held a dark substance in her hands and addressed her as if to her father. She laughed and said finally that they finally got together. Opilia tried to summon her father's soul using forbidden and extremely dangerous dark magic. Seeing this, Sylvester was extremely angry with Opilia. Sylvester, without thinking for a long time, locked Opilia in a dungeon, and the dark substance that the girl managed to summon was immediately burned. So Opilia was left alone with her thoughts. Opilia spent several months in a dark and dirty dungeon. She simply lay on the dirty floor and even refused to take the food that was regularly brought to her by the servants. The girl reflected on the fact that even though Ophilia's mind was shaken, the girl still had feelings for her parents, because she had tried so hard to bring her father back to life. The girl wondered for a moment if she could also use dark magic as skillfully as the real Opilia, but waving her hands, she realized that she was still unable to do anything. Opilia went to the window and opened the shutters. The girl looked at the clear sky and, breathing in the fresh air, decided that it was no longer important, because at the moment she is healthy and for now, Opilia is alive. In her past life, the girl suffered from an incurable disease, and every day was like a gift for her, because death with a scythe stood at the entrance to her ward while the doctors fought for her life. Therefore, finding herself in a healthy body was like a blessing for the girl, and she decided to live a long and happy life. All that remained was to limit herself from the main character, who hated her, and from her husband. To begin with, Opilia decided to divorce the Duke, and thereby rid herself of her married status. But when she approached the door of his office, she heard that he was not at home. The maid had already covered her head, expecting that her mistress would spank her for such an answer, but Opilia, turning away, said that in that case she should hurry to the next meeting. She thought that Sylvester agreed to this marriage only to form a strong alliance to oppose the crown prince. But when the dukedom of McGuffey fell, Sylvester might want a divorce. Opilia considered doing this to her to get a divorce and was afraid to even admit that Sylvester actually had some unhealthy feelings for Opilia and was keeping her around. The girl decided that in any case, even if Sylvester did not want to give her a divorce, she would make him ask her for it himself. The young girl decided to behave like the real Opilia, the most cruel and evil woman in the world, so that Sylvester would not be scared and beg her for a divorce himself. Contemplating her next plan of action, Opilia didn't notice that she had already reached the door, and decided that today's meeting would also be part of her plan to get a divorce. The best designers of their empire were waiting for Opilia behind this door, and the girl resolutely entered the room. The maid who followed the landlady was very surprised that these respectable ladies had gathered here. Madame Iona, Madame Ant, and Mademoiselle Chante were the most popular designers. It cost a fortune to invite someone alone to your home, and in this room they all gathered together. The ladies bowed and greeted Opilia. They said they were honored that Her Highness had invited them to an audience. But Opilia noticed how all the women were trembling with fear. Opilia sat comfortably in her chair and decided to play her role to the end. Then she caught herself thinking that the possible real Opilia was beating people instead of greeting them, which is why they were so afraid of her. Opilia immediately asked in a displeased tone if they had brought her a catalogue, and Mademoiselle Chante answered with a trembling voice that they had fulfilled all the whims of Her Highness, holding out Ophilia's catalogue. The other designers put a whole pile of catalogues in front of Opilia and said that they had gathered here the most fashionable novelties of the season so that Her Highness would have something to choose from. And Opilia looked at the designers and asked if there was any need at all to look at these catalogues. The women did not know what she meant and therefore trembled in terror, waiting for the reaction of Her Highness. Opilia suddenly added that the designers should give everything they have because she is not going to deny herself anything today. It was such an unexpected statement from Her Highness that even the maid was surprised. The girl roughly guessed that in one catalogue there are somewhere around 10 dresses, to which exquisite accessories are added. Even the real Opilia herself would not have been able to withstand such a level of extravagance. The maid, stammering, asked whether Her Highness was sure of her decision. Opilia asked in surprise if there could be any doubt in her words, and perhaps there was some other reason why she would not take them. The maid explained that before making a decision, Opilia usually measured all the dresses and scolded the designers for the fact that the dresses did not suit her in terms of size or taste. But the designers and the maid were very happy that today they had a slight fright and happily said that if Opilia so wishes, then today they will do everything exactly that way and finish the fitting as soon as possible. Opilia realized that the first point of the plan had completely failed and decided to go to her friend. She knew that Sylvester was very sensitive to the service staff and knew more than 100 servants by name. Therefore, the girl decided to treat the servant terribly so that Sylvester would divorce her without thinking, although, of course, Opilia did not want to do this at all. Opilia decided that if she didn't go all out, it would only make things worse. And the girl, approaching the servant girl, screamed with all her might, calling her here. The frightened maid froze in place and asked what Her Highness wanted. Opilia demonstratively ran her hand along the wall and showed the maid a crumb of dust, asking which old man she cleans so badly. The maid trembled with fear and began to apologize for not noticing this speck of dust. Opilia ran up and threw the bucket with all her might, which fell on the floor and dirty water spilled over the entire corridor. Then Opilia put her hands on her sides and ordered the maid to clean everything up first, while she would watch that this mindless maid didn't miss anything. The maid grabbed a rag and began to scrub the floor as hard as she could, trying to please Her Highness. She constantly apologized and said that she would definitely correct her shortcomings. Opilia watched from the sidelines as the frightened servant tried to please her and thought it was rather cruel of her, although she pursued her main goal, to get a divorce. The butler Oliver immediately ran to the rape in the corridor and asked what was happening here. Opilia thought that this was a good opportunity, and she must make the old man cry a little. Therefore, Opilia asked the butler in a stern voice why he interfered here, because she was simply teaching an incompetent maid to perform her duties with dignity. Opilia waited for the elderly man to get angry and mentally asked him to do it faster. Instead, the man smiled and clapped his hands. He said to Her Highness, "Bravo." And while Opilia was trying to understand what was happening here, the butler explained that the maid was probably so lazy that she washed the floor with dirty water and the owner of the estate made a decent remark to her. Oliver then examined the maid from head to foot and was greatly surprised, for he saw no marks of beatings or any of the mutilations upon the maid, which one should ordinarily expect from Opilia. Oliver was moved that Opilia had behaved so mercifully with the maid. Meanwhile, the girl thought that her second plan had completely collapsed, because she was still very, very far from the real Opilia. Then Opilia decided to go as far as possible. It was her last chance to get a divorce. She followed when her husband would leave his office to put this plan into practice. The girl knew that no matter how legendary a thief Opilia was, she could not stoop to such a thing with her pride, and therefore the girl decided to take advantage of this opportunity. Opilia waited until the sounds of her husband's footsteps completely disappeared in the corridor and slipped into his office. She knew where his savings were kept, so she quickly opened the cash drawer. At first, the girl thought to spend the stolen funds on handsome boys, but unfortunately, Ophelia's reputation was so terrible that no young man would want to spend time with her. Opilia then decided to look for a bill of exchange or some other valuable paper, so that Sylvester would be furious when he discovered it was missing. This is exactly what Opilia was counting on when she was looking for something valuable besides money. The girl thought about her husband, and how with such a stony face he constantly refused her an audience as soon as she came to his office. And she already tried to get a divorce 5 times. Opilia did not lose hope, and continued to examine the contents of the drawer. Unexpectedly, she came across the prices of the papers, which were carefully sealed with the Duke's personal seal. Opilia began to think about where she had seen this seal before, when she heard steps quickly approaching from behind. And then a stern male voice asked what she was doing here. The frightened girl quickly turned to see who had entered her husband's office. Shocked, Opilia saw that Sylvester Reason was standing in front of her, and his mood was completely bad. Then the girl ordered herself to calm down and play the role of a thief until the end, so she answered in the most calm tone that she was rummaging in his table. Opilia added that she was looking for money there, but it was nowhere to be found. Opilia was waiting for him to finally get angry, and she would get the divorce she wanted. But instead, he came close to her and said that she was finally behaving like a worthy mistress of their house. His blue eyes looked into her, and she, as if under a spell, could not look away from him. He only whispered that he finally waited for her to go for it. That girl had no idea what exactly he was talking about, so she waited for her husband to explain what he was talking about. Meanwhile, he was getting closer and closer to the shocked Opilia. At first, the girl thought that he might not have seen something and asked if he had seen her rummaging in his drawer. Sylvester, keeping his eyes on Opilia, said that of course he did. His hands were already touching her wrist, and regaining consciousness, Opilia pulled her hands away and said that she was trying to steal money from him, asking if he hadn't noticed. Sylvester bowed his head and answered that he understood that she was trying to steal money, and this was the fastest way to get someone else's property. And when he looked into Ophelia's eyes again, he added that he had not liked something for a long time. She realized that she was again hooked by his seductive gaze and could not tear her eyes away from him. Opilia finally turned away and touched her face with her hands to regain consciousness. She had no idea that when dealing with Sylvester, she would have to beware of his incredible ability. Opilia already knew that there were rumors that Sylvester got all his fortune and recognition in the aristocratic world thanks to this unusual ability. And this ability was that Sylvester managed to easily make anyone fall in love with him, thanks to his seductive charm, and then he could easily manipulate all the actions of the opponent. Sylvester watched his wife and how she tried not to catch his seductive gaze. Afterwards, the Duke asked if she knew he belonged to an informative guild. A satisfied smile appeared on Sylvester's face, and Opilia could not understand why he was so pleased. And then her gaze was drawn to the glitter of the jewelry in his hand. Opilia looked around and realized that it was her gold bracelet. Then she raised her hand and examined it more carefully, and only then was the girl finally convinced that the gold bracelet had disappeared from her wrist. Sylvester saw that the girl understood that she was left with her jewelry, and said with satisfaction that stealing information or wealth is one and the same, and in his guild it is the basic rule. And then the young man looked Opilia in the eyes and said that if she wanted, he could teach her the art of secret abduction as he himself possessed it. Opilia was horrified to realize that the frivolity was a failure, the insult of hearing had also failed, and the abduction on which she had so placed bets had also turned out to be complete failures. Having then lost all hope of Sylvester's consent to grant her a divorce, Opilia cried out with emotion, asking what she still had to do to get the accursed divorce from him. Sylvester looked at Opilia and understood what she wanted from him for so many days in a row. And the girl covered her mouth with her hands in fear, because she realized that she had said it out loud. Sylvester then said that her insistence on receiving it seemed rather suspicious to him, since she herself had said that she would rather see the lid of the coffin close over Sylvester than leave him. The man recalled Ophelia's words that she would stick to him and not leave him until he died. Then the girl, looking into Sylvester's eyes, offered to pretend that this did not happen and just break up. Sylvester did not understand why she wanted to get a divorce like that, because he was the most handsome man in the empire, and also the richest, whose fortune could last several lifetimes. Sylvester then directly asked Ophelia why she wanted a divorce. After all, it was profitable to be the Duchess of Reason. And besides, Sylvester didn't care about Ophelia's courtship of the crown prince. Ophelia understood that it was logical that Sylvester found her demand for a divorce quite strange, and therefore decided to use a single phrase, saying that she simply did not love him. The words of the young girl somewhat shocked the Duke, and he asked if she really loved the crown prince. This question was so unexpected that Ophelia did not immediately find what to say. Having understood Ophelia's answer without words, Sylvester turned away and said that he should not have asked her this question, because he guessed the right answer from her one look. After considering all possible options for a while, the Duke finally told Ophelia that he could agree to a divorce only if they made one agreement. Hope finally appeared in Ophelia's eyes. Meanwhile, Sylvester went to Ophelia, took her hand, and leaning towards her, whispered to her to seduce the crown prince and win him over to their side, and then she would get a divorce. The next morning, Ophelia and her husband went together on business. She could not find a place for herself the whole way, considering their agreement. Sylvester was reading the newspaper and asked why she was sighing so heavily. Ophelia said that she was unlikely to be able to make the crown prince their ally, and asked if he really thought this plan had any chance of success. Then Sylvester reminded that it was Ophelia who sneaked into the palace to the crown prince, intercepted the prince's invitation and dealt with all the invitees, and also threatened the prince himself. Ophelia understood Sylvester's whole plan because he personally supported the second prince as the next emperor, and the crown prince only created problems for him. This is why Sylvester was hostile to Crown Prince Kalin, who was supported by the current emperor himself. It was within these clashes that Ophelia appeared, who fell madly in love with the crown prince and played a decisive role in Sylvester's chess game. After all, through Ophelia, the intrigue of the crown prince received the attention of the general public, and because of this, the emperor had to publicly reprimand the crown prince. The deal that Sylvester offered for Ophelia to get such a long-awaited divorce was necessary for him to use the people to his advantage. The more Ophelia acted, the more the crown prince's position was shaken. Realizing this, Ophelia asked Sylvester how he could use his only wife so meanly. Then Sylvester, keeping his eyes on the newspaper, asked how she could run after another man, leaving her husband far behind, and he stated that it is far worse than what he is doing. The Duke suggested that after the divorce, Ophelia was planning to pursue the crown prince to the very end, and if she was going to do it, she'd better do it while she still had the title of Duchess. Ophelia pondered and asked Sylvester if he would really give her a divorce if she kept the deal, and the Duke, taking off his glasses, said that he would look forward to it. Ophelia looked into his eyes and understood that he would keep his word, so all that remained was to attract the crown prince to their side, and the divorce would be obtained. The coachman announced that they had arrived and helped Ophelia out of the carriage. She looked at the building and thought that for the first time in her life she was seeing a real imperial palace from romantic fantasies. Sylvester hastened to go after his wife and said that the imperial banquet had not been held for a long time, and surely the hereditary principle must necessarily be at it. The Duke caught up with Ophelia and adjusted the hair on her head. The girl was a little embarrassed by his touch, and he mysteriously asked if she knew what to do when they saw the crown prince. Sylvester explained that the hereditary principle had changed since their last meeting, and now it would be much more difficult to implement their plan. Ophelia replied that she would deal with it herself. The girl hastened to enter the palace because it was somehow uncomfortable for her to be alone with Sylvester. But when Ophelia entered the banquet hall, she was even more confused by the incredible number of guests present. The girl was in such a crowded place for the first time, and if there was no relocation to Ophelia's body, she would not even be able to dream of such a thing, because her illness did not allow her to move freely. But as soon as the girl appeared in the center of the hall, the aristocrats began to whisper around her, warning each other not to contact this woman, because they would immediately be cursed by her. The girl realized that these rumors were related not only to her, and turning around, saw that a handsome gray-eyed man with shiny blonde hair had entered the hall. It was Kalin von Regen, Crown Prince. Ophelia immediately recognized this man, because he looked exactly like the hero of her favorite novel. She began to think that her main task was to make him hate her less than he did now. But as soon as the crown prince saw Opilia, he immediately shouted to the guards to immediately escort this woman out of the banquet hall. Opilia was confused and did not know what to do. As the guards began to get closer and closer, Opilia understood that her mission could be over before it had even begun, so she shouted for them to stop and asked what kind of injustice it was, because she had done nothing. Kaylin said that maybe she didn't have time to do anything today, after the incident last week. They haven't fully recovered, and so he doesn't want it to happen again. Ophelia's eyes flickered, and she could not understand what was being said, because after her resettlement she behaved normally. But the prince reminded her about her invasion of the palace, stealing the invitation, waving her sword, etc. And then the crown prince said that the countess had recently been sent a secret package. Ophelia thought with fear that the real Ophelia had managed to do this before she was reincarnated. The crown prince reported that this parcel was full of cursed spells, and if there was no priest next to the countess, she would be cursed forever. Kaylin sternly asked if Ophelia knew what was written in that casket, and without waiting for her answer, he himself said that it was written female fox, and sternly asked who could have sent the countesses like that. Ophelia's eyes twinkled and said that she must be some kind of cruel person. But from the expression on the crown prince's face, the girl understood that he had completely different assumptions about the person who sent the curse. The crown prince said in a threatening tone that if Ophelia approached the countess again, he would not leave it alone. Ophelia uneasily replied that she would do as he said. But the crown prince began to shout that he meant that she not only did not approach, but also did not greet and did not look in the direction of his beloved countess ever in her life. Ophelia thought that she had already promised the prince to fulfill his request, but he continues to shout at her. Then she timidly asked the prince to inform the countess of his prohibition. Sylvester didn't like anyone making remarks about him and his countess, so he yelled for Ophelia to get out of here. Then the girl began to worry that she might have to leave after all. Sylvester shouted that if she didn't go as she wished, he would have her escorted out of here by force by his bodyguards and began to loudly call for the guards. Suddenly, Ophelia felt someone hug her and saw her husband next to her. Sylvester made a remark to the crown prince that he was rather rough with his wife. Sylvester said in a confident tone that there was no direct evidence that Ophelia had sent the casket, so there was no reason to blame his wife. And then, in a more stern tone, Sylvester added that his wife has the status of a duchess, so he would not advise the heir to communicate with her in such a tone. The crown prince decided to poke Sylvester and said with a smile on his face that he had heard rumors that this venerable lady had asked Sylvester for a divorce. Shocked, Ophelia began to wonder how the prince knew about this. And Kaylin went on to say that this venerable lady must have someone else whom she truly loves if she wants to divorce Sylvester. Ophelia felt uncomfortable and decided to somehow smooth over the situation by telling her husband that they should return to their seats. And I thought to myself that this Kaylin is quite a self-confident buffoon. But the Duke, after thinking, suddenly added that he could not divorce his wife, because he really loved her very much and did not want to lose his love. This statement sounded like thunder in the clear sky and greatly shocked Ophelia herself, and the crown prince, and all the aristocrats present who witnessed this conversation. Rumors began to spread in the hall about how to love this evil woman. Meanwhile, Ophelia decided to clarify some issues with her husband, so she asked the Duke to leave with her for a moment. Sylvester, meanwhile, was busy talking to an elderly man who looked Ophelia from head to toe with a keen eye and said that he was glad to meet Sylvester Raisin's wife. Sylvester, apologizing to his interlocutor, followed Ophelia, saying that she managed to save him from an unpleasant conversation. Ophelia quickly replied that she didn't do it on purpose. Ophelia was determined and going out on the balcony opened the door sharply. Then, when they were alone, the girl asked what kind of old man he behaved like that in front of the crown prince. Sylvester asked in surprise what exactly she meant and what he did wrong. An angry Ophelia then explained, asking why he told Kaylin that he loved her. Sylvester thought about it and answered that he did it precisely because now the crown prince will be even more interested in the girl his rival loves and will pay attention to her. Ophelia had not expected to hear such an explanation and questioned whether it was part of his plan. Sylvester answered with satisfaction that he did. Then the girl added that she couldn't believe it sounded so terrible. Ophelia replied with displeasure that next time he should warn her about such antics. After all, everyone was so shocked that they did not stop gossiping. even when Ophelia was very close. Ophelia began to shout that Sylvester's plan was not realistic at all, and that he had no idea with what hatred Callan had spoken to her during their conversation. Just remembering his expression made her sick. But Sylvester came closer to his angry wife and gently touched her cheek with his hand. He said that he believed that she would be able to do it, because she is the most beautiful woman on this continent. Ophelia, as if by a wave of a magic wand, immediately calmed down and kept her eyes on Sylvester. At that moment he seemed very attractive to her, and the girl wanted to fully trust his words. Completely enveloped in the moonlight, the man sparkled as if covered in stardust, so it seemed that Sylvester was glowing like the moon itself in the sky. Ophelia thought that maybe it was a charm. Taking control of herself, Ophelia answered that it doesn't matter how beautiful she is, because if she has a bad character, then it's all in vain. But Sylvester replied that objectivity only befits Ophelia. Then the girl replied that it was enough to give her insincere compliments, because she still accepted the terms of the agreement and intended to fulfill it to the end. Ophelia decided that since she knew more about the original story than anyone here, she would definitely find some way to the crown prince and make him fall in love with her. Then Ophelia added in a confident tone that in that case, she should add some more conditions to the deal, and if the crown prince had any feelings for her, Sylvester should pay her for it. Sylvester was very surprised by such an offer from Ophelia, while the girl meanwhile continued explaining that in order to live comfortably after the divorce, she needs a considerable amount of money. So Ophelia offered to pay 10 gold for the letter and 20 gold for the bouquet, and they would discuss other manifestations of the crown prince's attention as their relationship progressed. Sylvester knew a lot about money, so he first considered Ophelia's offer and said that he agreed to such an agreement. And then, taking out a gold penny from his pocket, he threw it into Ophelia's hands. Sylvester said this was the first installment in their plan. Ophelia looked at the gold coin with the royal seal in amazement and realized that it was equal to 50 ordinary gold coins. Ophelia bowed and said that she would gladly accept such a gift. Meanwhile, Sylvester came closer to her and whispered in her ear that he wanted to tell her a proverb. When Ophelia looked at the man, waiting for what he would say, he said that in the castles of resin, they are talking that you need to give as much as you get, because otherwise you can lose your hand. Already in her room before going to sleep, Ophelia thought that considering how Callan hates her now, it will not be surprising when she loses not only her arm but also her neck. Therefore, Ophelia decided that the only effective way to save her life and get freedom from her current husband would be to change the character of the main character. Ophelia knew that the love between Callan and Flur had been born when the Countess had saved him and helped him recover, so she decided that she needed to take some important steps. Although the girl guessed that such an act of hers would change the original plot of the novel, she needed to survive first, and only then worry about what would happen to all the main characters. The very next morning, over a cup of tea, Ophelia asked her maid, heroine, if the letter of invitation from the Countess Cardell had arrived. The Cardell family was one of the prominent noble families of the empire. This family received support from the past empress, and by mutual consent, the mother of the crown prince. Before her death, the late empress hid her last letter to the prince in the Cardell estate. However, Count Cardella's people did not know about the existence of this letter, so Ophelia decided to find it and deliver it to Cardella. Maybe after that he will look at her in a completely different way. The maid, as correctly as she could, asked if Ophelia was sure of her decision to visit this family, because, to put it mildly, she was not on very good terms with the owners of the estate. The maid recalled that Ophelia burned all the invitations from Countess Cardell with her own hands, saying that she was so majestic and powerful only because she had great wealth. Irene added that since Ophelia had been accused by the Countess at the ball, the invitations had stopped coming. The Countess had become very afraid of Ophelia, so she questioned whether she really wanted to visit the Cardell family. Ophelia replied that she would like to visit this family, but without an invitation, it would be somehow tactless. But the maid explained that Ophelia, according to her status, could simply visit them. Meanwhile, in the garden of Countess Cardell, a meeting was held with other representatives of aristocratic society, where they discussed the gift from the Count and how it suited the Countess herself. The ladies discussed that his ruby necklace beautifully emphasized the hair color of the Countess herself, and admired how attentive the man was. Then the ladies asked how the Countess had been lately. The ladies were discussing that the Count must think his wife the most beautiful woman in the world, if you give her such precious gifts. while the Countess was enjoying such flattering words. In fact, the Countess knew that all these women were only jealous of her, but these odes of praise which they sing to her at every meeting lift her mood. That is why she arranges these tea parties. The gaze of the Countess stopped at the only young girl, who did not say any compliments, but simply sat silently with a sad look at the edge of the table. It was a pretty girl with blue hair. The Countess had heard that her family was now on the verge of bankruptcy, and thought that if she was going to ask for handouts, she might as well make an effort to praise Countess Cardell as well. The Countess thought to herself that she should later teach this girl a lesson in how to behave in her presence. But for now, she smiled and offered to try on the jewelry, showing it in all its glory. All women gladly agreed to look at the jewelry, but one of the aristocrats, who was sitting facing the entrance to the garden, changed her expression and told the Countess to see who had come. When Countess Cardell turned around, she was almost speechless, because before her stood Opilia Resson in all her glory. Opilia greeted the landlady in a calm tone and asked how she was feeling. Opilia thought that it was difficult for her to deal with Sylvester or Kalina, and here was a whole group of aristocratic women. Therefore, the girl smiled sweetly and said that it would be good if they offered her a cup of tea. Countess Cardell was more worried than ever, but told herself to calm down, because she was now in her own house and did not want to fall face down in the dirt in front of the aristocrats, who kept their eyes on them. Therefore, Countess Cardell said that she would gladly offer Opilia to sit down, but unfortunately there is not a single free seat at the moment because she did not count on her arrival. Countess Cardell added that due to the lack of available space, they would not be able to serve the Duchess appropriately. The Countess added in her mind that Opilia should just get out of here. Then the girl, who had been sitting silently during the whole tea, suddenly got up from the table and invited Opilia to sit in her place, if of course she didn't mind. Opilia was simply over the moon with happiness at such an opportunity, and happily thanked the aristocrat for what she did. She hurried to the chair and settled comfortably on the table. At this time, Sylvester was watching this situation through the window, who would mentally ask Opilia what kind of old man she came here for and what she was up to. He was simply shocked when he saw her in the garden. Sylvester came to this estate to discuss his affairs with Count Cardell and could not understand how his wife got here, who simply hates this family. Behind him, a man asked what happened. Sylvester replied that he just saw his wife, and Count Cardell asked in surprise why she was here, because no one had sent her an invitation to the tea party, which was now taking place here. Sylvester then asked displeased how long his wife needed an invitation. To come to any of the estates, the status of the Duchess does not require any official letters. Hearing these words, and especially the tone in which the Duke uttered them, the Earl immediately bowed and begged forgiveness for his rash remarks about Opilia. But then Count Cardell said he was very sorry, but he had to go away for a few minutes to see how his wife was. Because after their last meeting with Opilia, she left by force. Sylvester, folding his hands on his chest, said that of course the Count could stay away, because if his wife made a scene here, then the Countess would not be jealous. The Count thanked for understanding. Sylvester well remembered how last time Opilia had simply doused the Countess from head to toe, explaining that her hair had caught fire, and she was simply saving the Countess. Recalling this incident, Sylvester noted that today will also be full of surprises, and will not go smoothly. Although, in his opinion, recently such surprises were waiting for him almost every day. There was a knock on the door, and the Duke's assistant came in, who asked what happened here, because he met a frightened Count who was running as fast as he could, and he looked as if someone had died. Sylvester calmly said that just then his wife and assistant said that now she understood everything. The Duke asked to watch his assistant's tongue, and he replied that he would do just that. The assistant said that he heard that only yesterday his wife mentioned the divorce again, and Sylvester, who was reviewing important documents, exhaled and replied that it was so. The aide said that if they filed a counterclaim, they could forfeit almost all of the assets and leave Opilia with nothing in the divorce. Therefore, you should not be afraid of this divorce. The aide replied that much so, as he also believes that Opilia only tarnishes the Duke's reputation, and a divorce could relieve Sylvester of such a burden and further strengthen his position in the aristocratic world. But Sylvester sighed and said that he loves this girl, because Opilia from the MacGuffin Duchy is the first woman who did not succumb to Sylvester's charm, and that affected him very much. Then Sylvester looked out the window again and said that Opilia was more useful to him than ever, because the more stupid fame she has, the less attention is paid to him. Herzog said the recent news about the road tax increase was quickly forgotten once news of Ophelia's sword incident broke. In addition, Ophelia is currently engaged in a delicate business. Sylvester said that Ophelia was seeking the prince's attention now, and the aide noted that it had happened before. But Sylvester explained that she used to do it like a bull going headlong, but now like a sly fox. Although Ophelia managed to find a seat at the table, the atmosphere was so tense that she felt somewhat uncomfortable and turned her attention to the red ruby ornament that was mentioned in the novel. So Ophelia asked if it was a dragon necklace. Then Countess Cardell replied that even the Duchess knew about such rare jewelry and that it was actually a gift from her husband. Then Ophelia smiled and wanted to give a compliment because in fact it looked just perfect. As soon as Ophelia said that the necklace was beautiful, the Countess immediately changed her face. All the aristocrats immediately thought that the Duchess wanted to take the necklace from the Countess and began to say that it should not be taken away, because this gift is a symbol of the Count's love for his wife. The aristocrats added that Ophelia could not have it, no matter how much she wanted it, and asked the Countess to deny Ophelia this. Confused, Countess Cardell looked at Ophelia in shock. Countess Cardell knew that Ophelia was a witch who used a curse that the best priest could not dispel, so she was afraid to upset her and expose herself or someone in the family to this curse. Ophelia looked shocked at the aristocrats who refused her the precious necklace and could not understand where they got the idea that she wanted to take it away. She thought that everything was different in short stories. Ophelia decided to explain everything because it was just her innocent compliment in order to diffuse the situation at the table. Therefore, she raised her hand and said that there was a misunderstanding. But as soon as Countess Cardell saw Ophelia's raised hand, she immediately remembered the last incident when Ophelia poured water on her and therefore covered her head with her hands. The frightened Countess crouched down and waited for some blow or other manifestation of aggression from Ophelia, because she was convinced that the Duchess wanted to take her jewelry. After sitting like that for a while, the Countess realized that nothing was happening and decided to see if the danger had passed, so she opened her arms and looked at Ophelia. Ophelia was so frightened by the Countess's reaction that she involuntarily touched a cup of tea, which spilled not only on the table, but also on her clothes. The Countess saw this and told the Duchess that her clothes were dirty. Then the Countess began to think that perhaps Ophelia had come here and set up this scene to accuse the Countess and take away this necklace, or else to put a curse on her. Therefore, Countess Cardell decided to give her necklace to Ophelia because she was very afraid that due to the curse, Ophelia could harm not only her, but also any of her husbands. Holding out the casket where the precious necklace lay, Countess Cardell asked Ophelia to accept this gift from her. But Ophelia, shocked, asked why she was giving her the necklace. Ophelia began to make excuses, saying that she did not come for this at all, and the Countess fearfully said that if she wanted to get something else, she had nothing more valuable than this necklace. Ophelia didn't even know how to explain to the Countess that she didn't need the necklace. But then she felt someone hand her a handkerchief from behind. When Ophelia returned, she saw a girl who gave way to her. Ophelia understood that this girl wanted the Duchess to offer a handkerchief to the Countess in order to calm her down and wipe away her tears. So Ophelia decided to take advantage of this offer. Ophelia sat down next to the Countess, who was upset and could not calm down, and handing them a handkerchief, they told her to wipe her tears because Ophelia would get angry and throw this necklace into the trash. Hearing these words, the Countess was even more frightened. Ophelia realized that the words were again misunderstood. Meanwhile, the Countess rose sharply to her feet and said that she was not feeling well. Apologizing to the guests, the Countess shouted that the tea party would be over and ran to the estate. Ophelia and the aristocrats continued to sit on the grass, not knowing what to do next. Holding the casket with the dragon necklace in her hands, Ophelia realized that it was the most valuable piece of jewelry, as it was made from discarded dragon skin and decorated with a fiery ruby. Ophelia estimated the value of this jewelry and realized that she could easily buy the entire duchy, and therefore she would not have to serve Sylvester anymore to get a few gold coins. But Ophelia decided to bring the case to the end, keeping the agreement with the Duke, and shouted to the maid that Ophelia Raisin wanted to see Count Cardell immediately. The meeting was organized after a few minutes. Count Cardell immediately apologized to Ophelia for not properly preparing for Duchess Ophelia's visit. Ophelia replied that there was no need to apologize because she had come unexpectedly. She asked the Earl if he had heard from his wife that she had given her the dragon necklace. The Count said that his wife had already told him everything, and she also said that she gave it as a gift from the bottom of her heart. Opilia smiled because she knew how things really happened, and then holding out a casket with a precious ornament, Opilia told Count Cardell that she was returning this gift, because it was too extravagant for her. The Count was very surprised. Count Cardell was amazed by such generosity of Duchess Opilia and did not know how he should now accept the gift back, because he felt quite uncomfortable in such a situation. Opilia decided to kill two birds with one stone, so she began to say that returning the gift from Countess Cardell could tarnish their family's reputation. And while the Earl pondered this proposal, Opilia immediately added that she was offering to exchange the dragon necklace for one painting from their home collection, which would be considered an equal exchange. On the way home, Opilia felt very happy, because her offer turned out to be very profitable for both her and Count Cardell, so he easily said goodbye to the painting and got the dragon necklace back. And Opilia finally received such a long-awaited letter from the late Empress Margaret to the Crown Prince. She knew that the letter was hidden behind the picture, but she did not even think that it was so inconspicuous. The girl regretted that she had to give the dragon necklace for such a poor picture, but hoped that when everyone learned about such an unequal exchange, they would be surprised and admit that Opilia had changed. But the next morning, Ophilia's good mood was ruined when Sylvester read them the headlines in the local press, which said that the Duchess had insulted the Countess of Cardell and stolen a self-portrait. Opilia thought that it was not enough just to be called a thief, when she had no idea that the portrait of some old man would actually turn out to be a famous artist. Therefore, the girl decided to return that cursed picture to Count Cardell in order not to tarnish her reputation in the future, especially since she already had a letter from the past empress in her hands. But Sylvester did not even want to hear about the return of the painting. He said that returning such a valuable thing is a great folly. Herzog added that once the painting was in their hands, there was no question of returning it. Sylvester said that in 10 years this painting would be worth millions of gold. But Opilia noted that for this, the artist must first die. Sylvester, smiling, said that judging by the appearance of the artist, he will not last even 10 years, so it will not be long before its price increases. But Opilia was even more outraged by his thoughts. So she shouted for the Duke to return the picture to her immediately, and she would take it to Count Cardell. Opilia added that now, because of this cursed picture, her reputation was under attack again. Sylvester looked carefully at his wife and asked, since when did she start worrying about her reputation? After all, until today, Opilia did not care what those around her would think about her. The Duke advised her to live as before and not to save her reputation, especially since if you remember everything that Opilia has done until today, her reputation is already at the bottom. The girl realized that Opilia is the devil in the flesh for everyone around her, and no matter how she tries to treat people well or do good deeds, everyone will look at her because of Ophilia's crimes. Opilia then looked at her husband, whose words proved to be the truth, and sadly said that unfortunately she had no ally at the moment to plan her future life. Sylvester, hearing these words of Opilia, came almost close to her and quietly asked why she thought he was not on her side. The girl looked into his eyes again and got lost there. Opilia really wanted to believe him, but knowing the real plot of the novel, she knew that his good words could not be trusted. So the girl ordered herself to come to her senses and soberly assess the situation. That's why Opilia immediately refused for him to close the box, because it is through him that she goes through these circles of hell, so his jokes about her not being alone are not very appropriate now. Sylvester thought that not even a day had passed since his wife Opilia shook the whole country again. No matter where he went, she was gossiped about from small to large, and everyone did not care about the fact of raising taxes. People were much more interested in rumors than boring politics. Opilia attracted all attention with her charm, and even more with her antics, which were discussed for several weeks in a row. Therefore, Sylvester has already decided that he will allow Opilia to do whatever she wants, as long as she does not leave him. Because he was the darkness that found freedom in its light. Sylvester thought that Opilia should be free only at his side as long as he would let her. While reviewing today's correspondence, Sylvester was surprised to pick up another letter. After reading the addressee, Sylvester held out the letter to Opilia and said that this letter was addressed to her. The girl had no idea who could have written it and began to look at the letter with interest. This letter was from Jasmine Smith, who reported that this was her first letter addressed to Duchess Opilia, and she hoped it would not cause too much inconvenience on her part. The letter went on to say that the girl was in an awkward situation yesterday due to the fact that she is quite shy and cannot but show off her success in communication, so she could not join the conversations of other ladies. Jasmine wrote that she had already received hints that she did not fit into the social circle of aristocratic women. Opilia now realized that it was the girl who had given up her place to the Duchess of Cardell. Jasmine added that thanks to Opilia she was able to leave the tea party in time and thereby avoid punishment from Countess Cardell, so she thanked Opilia for her help. On this day, the weather turned out to be beautiful and sunny, and Opilia was happy that a good mood and a good sunny day only contributed to a successful audience with the Crown Prince. Therefore, Opilia decided to visit the Imperial Palace today. While getting into the carriage, she noted that while the story is developing according to the original plot, no one can guarantee what will happen next. The young girl decided to act exactly like the main character and thereby take her place in this story. Therefore, Opilia decided to act quickly and copy all the steps of Countess Flur. The landlady rehearsed loudly, asking her husband if he was capable of ironing and cleaning. She shouted that homeless orphans are a useless layer of their society. After receiving only criticism, the man apologized and said that he would now clean everything up and do it properly. But everyone knew that nobody cared about Khrushchev and what happened there. Nevertheless, Countess Fleur built shelters for the homeless with her own funds. In addition, Fleur possessed the qualities of a swordsman, and the royal family highly appreciated her efforts. The royal family duly rewarded Fleur for her achievements, and it was then that the position of the main character was strengthened. But Opilia decided to steal this idea of Fleur about the organization of a shelter for the homeless. On the way to the Imperial Palace, Opilia pondered how she could earn the Crown Prince's recognition. She was distracted from her thoughts by the coachman's voice, who said that they had already arrived. Getting out of the carriage, Opilia began to look at the majestic Imperial Palace and said that it looked much better during the day than at night. Of course, she did not receive an invitation from Kalin. Although Opilia informed the Crown Prince in advance about her visit and that her case is very delicate. Despite this, she was met by a guard who said that the prince had forbidden Opilia to enter. The girl looked at the guards in surprise and asked them to deliver the letter to His Highness. She counted on the fact that when the prince read it, he would certainly allow Opilia to enter. The guard took the letter as disgustingly as if she had handed him some kind of dead cat. Left alone, Opilia waited for more than an hour and noted that being under the burning sun was quite unbearable. Finally, the guard appeared and apologized for making the girl wait on the street. Of course, Opilia was indignant at this attitude towards her on the part of the guard, but tactfully replied that nothing terrible had happened. Opilia hastily straightened her dress and said that they could go to the living room now. But the guard shockingly reported that, unfortunately, the Crown Prince did not allow the girl to enter. Opilia could not imagine such a response from Kalin at all, so she asked the guard if the prince had really read the letter that she had handed over, and the man confirmed that he saw with his own eyes how the prince read it. Opilia then asked what exactly the prince replied after reading the letter. The guard said that if the transmission was literal, the prince told Opilia to go away from the palace. Opilia was just furious, because it cost her so much effort to get that damned letter from the Crown Prince's mother, and he didn't even manage to tell her the answer in person. This letter was Ophilia's brilliant attempt to improve relations with the heir to the prince, and she was so sure that this plan was perfect that she did not even prepare any alternatives. Opilia did not understand why the prince remained indifferent to this letter, and thought that he must have hated Opilia so much that even a touching letter from his mother could not improve his attitude towards the Duchess. Then Opilia began to think that maybe when she builds a shelter for the homeless and engages in charity, the Crown Prince will finally understand that Opilia has changed for the better. Then Opilia heard her name being called, and when she raised her head, she saw Fleur William in person. The young girl smiled and said that she was glad to see Opilia, the embodiment of the goddess herself in this story with an angelic character and a lovely face. This is exactly how Opilia imagined Fleur. She was the savior of Crown Prince Kalin. Opilia could not take her eyes off the pretty girl who appeared before her. Finally, she saw how beautiful and friendly Fleur was, so there was no doubt that she was the main character. Fleur then apologized for greeting the Duchess first, but Opilia, smiling, answered that the light simply blinded her eyes and she could not immediately answer the Countess. Then Fleur smiled sweetly and said that it was an incredible relief that the Duchess had reacted so to her greetings, because the girl was already starting to worry. Opilia noted that she was very nervous when talking to this sweet girl, especially after their sudden meeting, and could not understand what caused this excitement. The girl understood that in the original story Opilia had done too many terrible things for Fleur, and all this only worsened with the development of events. But in the end, Opilia was executed precisely because of this. After all, due to her regular attacks on the Countess Fleur, Crown Prince Kalin simply became enraged and gave the order to execute Opilia. The girl said that she must remember that for Fleur she is a real enemy, and that in order to survive here, Opilia must make friends with the Countess. So Opilia asked in a calm voice how Fleur was. Fleur quickly replied that she was perfectly fine and asked the Duchess herself a counter-question, to which Opilia thanked for the concern and replied that everything is fine with her, too. Fleur smiled, and Opilia noted that despite all the horrors that Opilia had done for her, the girl probably did not hold a grudge against her at all. Fleur then asked what Opilia was doing here. Opilia, without even thinking, answered that she wanted to see the Crown Prince, but he did not even allow her to enter. Fleur's face flashed an ominous smile, and Opilia thought it appeared to her. Fleur said out loud that she was also on her way to the Crown Prince, and she would definitely tell him that she met Opilia on the way. And at the end, the Countess smiled sweetly again. Opilia said goodbye to Fleur and wished her a good day. They parted and each went her own way. Fleur to the Crown Prince, and Opilia returned home with nothing. All the way Opilia was thinking about this sudden meeting, and she was especially worried about that hideous smile that appeared on Fleur's face. That girl consoled herself with the fact that it all seemed to her. Opilia was sure that Fleur knew for a fact that Opilia was interested in the hereditary principle. Therefore, Opilia was surprised by Fleur's reaction when she was sure that the prince had escorted her out when she tried to meet him. That feeling as if Fleur had specifically mocked Opilia during their meeting did not leave the girl, but she nevertheless convinced herself that it was all just her imagination. After all, Fleur was supposed to be the kindest person in this whole story, and she was so merciful that even when she was insulted, she always excused those people and asked Kalin not to order them. The girl thought that because she is in Ophelia's body, that is why she is thinking so negatively. Opilia calmed herself down and ordered not to jump to conclusions, because time would put everything in its place. Opilia thought that maybe their meeting with Fleur would be the beginning of their strong friendship, and she would be able to change the plot of the original story. But the girl did not have time to get out of the carriage when she saw that the Duke was waiting for her. The girl looked out the window and could not believe her own eyes, because it was clear from the stern look on the man's face that he was in a bad mood. Opilia remembered that before leaving, she left him a note, where she informed that she had gone to the Crown Prince and advised Sylvester to prepare the funds, according to their agreement. Now Opilia regretted that she was so sure of her successful trip, because she returned home with nothing. When she got out of the carriage, Sylvester asked in a stern voice what she was doing there again. Opilia, as best she could, removed her casual smile and said that she had done nothing, but Sylvester shouted that she should not lie to him and showed a letter from the Crown Prince. Opilia could not believe that the letter was delivered faster than she could get home. Therefore, she quickly snatched this paper from Sylvester's hands and began to read it on her own. Unfolding the scrap of paper, Opilia read that it said that Duke Sylvester should come to the palace immediately with his wife, and that the letter was written in Kalin's hand. But further was written even worse, because the Crown Prince threatened to make Duke Sylvester and Opilia pay for the fact that they contacted his wife. After waiting for Opilia to read the letter, Sylvester loudly asked the girl what kind of old man she had rushed there, and what she had done there that the Crown Prince had sent such a threatening letter. Opilia begged to believe that she had done absolutely nothing wrong. But Sylvester, knowing his wife's character, just sighed and told her to follow him. The carriage brought them very quickly to the imperial palace, but Opilia did not seem so handsome. At the door, they were met by a familiar guard who informed them that the prince was waiting for the Reason couple. The guard told them to follow him and went ahead. Sylvester confidently walked ahead, and Opilia hurried after her husband, fearfully waiting for what would happen next. Having caught up with her husband, Opilia reported that this bodyguard had offended her, because he had left her waiting on the street under the scorching sun for an answer from the Crown Prince. Sylvester then calmly remarked that Opilia was the insult expert, as she had recently insulted the Duchess of Pinnan by saying she looked like a grain of rice. Opilia was quick to say she was sorry. Hearing this, Silver suddenly stopped and turned to his wife, asking what exactly she was apologizing for. Opilia explained that she apologizes for calling someone a grain of rice, and whether to forgive her or not is up to them. Sylvester's cold gaze pierced Opilia through and through. Opilia saw the man's reaction and decided to explain that she was going to somehow improve the opinion of others about her person, so she believes that an apology will change the opinion towards her. The girl thought that she should become better in order to live peacefully after the divorce. Opilia even considered that she should hide somewhere for several years so that the rumors about her would be completely forgotten. Opilia dreamed of living somewhere remote in a small house, preferably with a nice garden. The girl wanted to surround herself with everyone she loves so much, and just with one idea about it, I was already happy. Sylvester did not recognize his wife and looked stunned as she glowed with happiness, standing in front of him with her eyes closed. Meanwhile, Opilia imagined her future happy life. His gruff voice, asking if she should even try to make the rumors about her go away, brought her back to harsh reality, and Opilia opened her eyes. Sylvester added that the more bad things she did, the better for him. Opilia added that because of her frenzy, Sylvester just wanted to do his dirty work. Upon hearing this from his wife, Sylvester was stunned to say that he was amazed at her fine mind and informed her that she was in the top 10. And then he turned sharply and headed for the door. When Sylvester approached the guard, he informed that the crown prince was already waiting for them. But suddenly, Duke Racine struck the man and he fell to the floor. Leaning over the bewildered guard, Sylvester whispered in his ear that he had heard rumors that the man had tried to insult his wife. The guard was not joking and did not know what to answer. Then the Duke added that he would not excuse the guard a second time, and he also said that he has one hobby, collecting round things, and the head of the guard would fit nicely into his exclusive collection. Stepping away from the humiliated bodyguard, Sylvester looked at his wife and in a calm tone offered her an audience with the crown prince. Passing the guard, who was sitting on the floor, Opilia thought that her husband should care about their family's reputation and stand up for his wife, even if he is not interested in her. At such moments, the girl had no doubt that Sylvester Racine is a real thief, and she should behave as carefully as possible in his presence. Sylvester was the most influential figure in the empire. He was the head of the faction that advocated the interests of the nobles, and because of his incredible influence, no one could criticize his actions. Therefore, none of the aristocrats dared to speak a word against Sylvester Racine, except Colleen. That is why there was competition between them for influence on aristocratic society. Entering the room, Opilia saw how the crown prince was comforting a crying Flur and was simply furious. As soon as Callan saw Opilia, he immediately said that she had finally appeared. Without waiting for an answer from the confused Opilia, Callan immediately shouted that he had warned the Duchess not to go near Fleur and asked what kind of old man she had not heeded his request. Opilia couldn't believe how sneaky the lovely Fleur was and began to explain that the Countess must have been upset that Opilia had just greeted her outside the palace this morning. Opilia could no longer contain her emotions and shouted that it was the Countess who spoke to her first, and Opilia only responded to her greetings. Opilia dreamed that their meeting ended quite positively. Opilia shouted, asking the Countess if everything was really like that and why she is twisting the situation now and complaining about it to the Crown Prince. But Fleur continued to sob and say that she was afraid of Opilia. Fleur wept so casually and begged forgiveness from Opilia herself that Opilia wanted to applaud the acting of the Countess because she could not believe that the main character was capable of such a vile reason. The Crown Prince was already impatient to see how Opilia was calmly reacting to this whole situation, and he shouted, demanding that she stop making such an innocent face. But Opilia indignantly asked what was wrong with her face, because she was born like that and behaves as she sees fit. She did not understand at all that the real Opilia could love this fool. And the Crown Prince continued to repeat that Opilia immediately apologized to Fleur for the insult. Callan threatened not to forgive Opilia for this, because this time she would not be able to get away with it. Opilia was simply furious. It was offensive to her that she had to apologize for a conversation that consisted of a simple greeting and a wish for health. She wanted to deny the prince, but she was afraid to anger him even more. Opilia then decided to agree to the prince's terms and ask for the damned apology. She thought that if the letter had not improved their relationship with Callan, then maybe the apology would change something. Of course, the girl had to step over her pride, and it pissed her off all the more that she would have to apologize for something she didn't actually do. Still, Opilia approached Fleur. Opilia bowed and said that she had been rude to Fleur, and for that she wanted. But before she had time to prove this phrase to the end, a man's hand covered her mouth and the Duke asked her to be silent. Sylvester appeared in front of the Crown Prince, covering Opilia with his back, and asked him what his wife did wrong when she first greeted Fleur and what she should apologize for. It was so unexpected that the Crown Prince did not know what to say, because a really simple greeting did not require an apology from the Duchess, and Kaelin could not admit it. Therefore, he firmly told Sylvester that the situation was such that he needed an apology from his wife, and that would be enough. And then he asked the Duke if he could be sure that Opilia had done nothing wrong. Opilia was amazed that Sylvester was so determined to defend her before the Crown Prince. Meanwhile, the Duke continued to say that he was sure that his wife had done nothing wrong. Sylvester added that even if his wife looked as intimidating as Fleur said, he didn't understand why the prince would demand an apology from her if they had only exchanged innocent greetings. Sylvester asked if it is really difficult for Kalina to understand and figure out who is right here. But the Crown Prince just shouted loudly, if that was all Sylvester wanted to say. The Duke, smiling, said that he had something more to add and asked why they were both summoned to the palace. And if Opilia did something wrong, then it will be enough to simply blame Sylvester for it. Opilia was amazed at how boldly Sylvester spoke to the Crown Prince and asked if he dared to protect her in such a way. And Sylvester replied that of course he would always protect her. And when their eyes met and Sylvester saw that Opilia was looking at him with gratitude, he smiled at her and said that he was doing this only because he trusted her completely and completely. Opilia thought to herself that Sylvester was certainly lying when he said these words to her, and did not even blush. And when she looked at the Crown Prince, she was scared because of how angry he was. Kaelin yelled that at the last social event, he had made it clear to Opilia not to come anywhere near Fleur, and therefore the prince should punish her for disobeying his order. Sylvester was not going to back down, so he spoke decisively, asking where it was written in the law that women should not greet each other when they meet by chance on the street. Everyone knew that Opilia was never punished for her actions because she used the influence of her husband, who knew all the laws and how to circumvent them when it was beneficial to him. But the Crown Prince asks Sylvester if he does not think that the time has come to answer for his actions, and he cannot be so self-confident that Opilia will again be left without orders. And then Sylvester said that if the prince thinks it strange that the Duke is protecting his wife, then what is the Crown Prince doing when he is protecting Fleur, who has a legitimate husband? Sylvester added, asking if the Crown Prince didn't find the phenomenon even more strange. Fleur, hearing these words, immediately began to cry and asked how he could say such things about her. Hearing such things from Sylvester's mouth was simply unbearable for Fleur, so she had nothing better to do than just run away because it was really true. Opilia wanted to applaud her husband for his cleverness, because Fleur was currently engaged to the Earl, and although they were currently at loggerheads, Fleur was officially his wife. Having met the Crown Prince, Fleur fell in love with him and their love blossomed. Of course, this was not legal, because she was still in a marital relationship with someone else. The peaceful prince turned as white as chalk, and it was clear that every muscle on his face was pulsating with anger. But he could not deny anything, because it was the truth that they were afraid to say to his face. The only thing left for him was to shout to Sylvester that he would not just leave it like that, and that Sylvester would definitely have to answer for these words. With that, the prince ran to catch up with his tearful Fleur. Opilia had to admit that it was unsurpassed, and a satisfied Sylvester stroked his head with his hand. He thanked his wife for such unexpected compliments. Sylvester looked thoughtfully at the back of the Crown Prince, who ran away, and said that even blind love must have a line that no one, not even a prince, can cross. Callan ran to catch up with Fleur because he wanted to comfort her. Even more, the prince wanted to kill Sylvester on the spot, but he perfectly understood that he had no reason to do so now. Sylvester was calling Fleur and asking her to stop. That girl ran on, and only when the prince caught up with her and took her by the hand, she stopped and turned around looking at Kaelin. The Crown Prince immediately said that he would never forgive the Rezin family for insulting his beloved, so she should trust him and wait for the day when he would avenge her. Kaelin was seething with rage, which had begun to build since the morning when he had received a letter from his late mother. There was no doubt in Kaelin's mind that it was his mother's handwriting. Reading that letter, many emotions immediately arose in the Crown Prince, and unfortunately, there were also negative ones among them. Therefore, he began to get angry that it was Opilia who brought him this letter. The hereditary principal swore to Fleur that he would definitely take revenge for this insult to Opilia and Sylvester, even if he had to risk everything he had at the moment. Kaelin hugged Fleur and asked her to calm down and trust him. With tears in her eyes, Fleur said that she did not care at all about the insults that were said in her direction. Fleur then added that she was worried about the situation, that because of her, a lot of negative things were also said towards the crown prince, and because of this, her heart was torn apart. The crown prince gently wiped the tears from his beloved's face and asked how she could say such words and not worry about herself at all, thinking only of him. The crown prince asked himself how he could not love the girl who saved him from death, looked after him for a long time, gave him her beautiful smile and faith in tomorrow. Therefore, the prince said that he would wipe Sylvester off the face of the earth, no matter what it cost him. But Fleur cautiously noted that Sylvester is the head of the faction of aristocrats, and you need to be very careful with him. The crown prince was amazed that Fleur continued to care for him even when she was in pain. Therefore, he said it out loud and gently hugged his beloved. Kaelin asked why Fleur was so kind and rested his head on her gentle shoulder. Meanwhile, the girl smiled again, because now Kaelin's main goal was to destroy Opilia and Sylvester. On the way home in the carriage, Opilia said that today she had so many events that she was very tired and wanted to get home as soon as possible and rest. Opilia added that even though the crown prince had left with his angry comment, it still bothered Opilia a lot because she was worried that the prince wouldn't leave the Reasons alone. Sylvester smiled and said that it was just a cheap threat, like a street brawl, so it wasn't worth paying attention to, and asked why Opilia had stopped. When Opilia asked what he meant, Sylvester explained that the girl first got angry and then decided to apologize. He said that she should have defended her right to the end. But Opilia remarked, asking if it wasn't Sylvester himself who asked her to seduce the crown prince, and therefore she didn't want to complicate relations with him, although he barely restrained his anger. Sylvester explained that the more he cares about and defends Opilia, the more the hereditary principal will take an interest in her and want to take a closer look at her. Opilia listened attentively to Sylvester's explanation and asked why he was so strict with the guard before entering the crown prince's living room. The duke was surprised by this question and, after thinking about it, answered that the guard was simply unlucky and fell under the hot hand. Then Opilia thought that the duke should invent something more believable. Then the girl suddenly remembered that every day of her past life, when she spent in the hospital, she did not know what would happen to her next and could not breathe freely. The girl prayed fervently every day. Therefore now, looking at these landscapes, which they came to on the way home, Opilia noted that this was the miracle that the Lord had given her, the miracle when she could breathe fresh air. To feel healthy, Opilia considered it a true miracle that should be fought for. She decided to first seduce the crown prince and then divorce Sylvester and live happily ever after. Opilia was brought back from her dreams by the duke's voice, who asked why she acted like that. Opilia explained that she wanted to be better. Sylvester then asked if she had thought of becoming better in order to seduce the prince. Opilia replied that this is exactly why she wanted to get better, because only by seducing the prince would she be able to get a divorce. The duke smiled and said that in that case he would see how she got on with it. And then Sylvester unexpectedly asked why Opilia had changed so dramatically lately, because before she not only did not pay attention to him, but also never spoke to him. Opilia replied that he hated her himself after the incident when she summoned her father's soul. But Sylvester replied that she also hated him, so he thinks that they are the same with her. Sylvester suddenly took Ophelia's hand and kissed her tenderly. He said that he would not ask her what happened, because he did not care. The duke asked simply to make him happy. Sylvester looked at the young girl with such a look, as if a child had received his first toy. Opilia knew in her mind that he was just playing with her, but some part of her wanted to believe him. Already at home, when the girl was left alone with her thoughts, she remembered his piercing gaze and how gently he spoke to her for a long time. A blush appeared on her cheeks from the memories alone. Nevertheless, Opilia decided to put aside these thoughts and take up important matters. She took a pen and began to carefully write down important calculations on paper. Several days have passed since that incident in the imperial palace. The girl was alarmed that Kaelin behaved suspiciously quietly, which she did not expect from him. Opilia thought that even though he was the crown prince, he had better stay out of the Reason family. Then she put down her pen and looked at her calculations, because there was not much time left until the X day. The girl decided to follow a clearly defined plan, and therefore all these days she was developing a project to open a shelter. When everything was detailed, she was over the moon with happiness. The feeling that Opilia was taking something from Flur did not leave her for a moment, and the girl forbade herself to think about it in order not to be distracted from important matters. At first, the girl even felt some guilt for this idea, and then she began to reassure herself that she was not doing anything wrong, because she was only worried about her happy future. Recently, a lot of questions appeared in the girl's head, to which she did not know the answer. Among them were whether the real Opilia knew about all this, and why the girl became so kind. Opilia then decided that there was no difference in the answers to these questions, because now her life was here and she needed to understand Fleur as a person, not some character in a romantic plot. Therefore, going to breakfast with Duke Sylvester, Opilia decided to discard all unnecessary thoughts from her head and focus her attention only on the plan and how to implement it. With a sinking heart, Opilia waited for her husband to have breakfast and for his mood to become as good as possible. As soon as he took the first sip of tea, the girl decided that the time was perfect. But before she had time to say anything to him, the Duke immediately answered that no. Opilia was indignant that he could refuse without listening to her, and Sylvester explained that the girl had rather strange plans, and he would not agree anyway. Then Opilia said in a serious tone that she would not sit silent until he heard her. Sylvester replied that she still did not have the funds to implement these plans. Opilia still asked to give her a chance and listen to her idea, because she is really just brilliant. She insisted that Sylvester listened to her so much that he finally allowed her to tell him about his plans. Opilia was happy and, coming closer to Sylvester, announced that she wanted to build a shelter. Sylvester blinked in bewilderment and asked where exactly she was going to do it. The girl said that she plans to build it in Khrushchev, and explained that the Reason family is more known for their evil deeds than their good deeds, and that's why she advised to change something in their routine life. Opilia said that although it didn't look too bad, it could lead to disastrous consequences later, so she offered to do a couple of good deeds. But no matter how Opilia tried to persuade her husband, he only listened in amazement to all her arguments and asked if she had been struck by lightning that she was now spouting such nonsense. Sylvester remarked that Opilia had never thought of such a fool before. Opilia indignantly asked how much he would attribute to her for her past actions, since she was now completely changed. Sylvester couldn't believe he was hearing this from his wife. Meanwhile, she offered him to try something new because they had already done a lot of bad things in life. Then Opilia mysteriously added that they can pretend to be good people to change the opinion of others about them. After these words, Sylvester began to laugh loudly. Sylvester said that her idea had a grain of salt, and they could try to play nice, so he had no choice but to accept her proposal. Opilia jumped for joy, because she did not expect Sylvester to agree so quickly. Therefore, she immediately thought that it would be necessary to invest in the project as much as possible, because it will be large-scale. But the joy of the young girl did not last long, because the Duke's assistant flew into the living room and called his master. Opilia immediately understood that there was no smell of good news here. Sylvester asked the assistant what happened, because he always knocks before entering, and the assistant quickly announced that a summons had arrived from the court. The assistant began to list what exactly they were accused of in court, and among other things were threats, violence, blackmail, extortion, and much more. Opilia, who a second ago was rejoicing in her victory, realized that now Sylvester would not be ready to build a shelter, because he had a responsible court case ahead of him. At first, Sylvester was so angry that he slammed his fist on the table and shouted the name of the crown prince. And then, as he began to familiarize himself with the documents, a smile appeared on his face. Opilia, who watched her husband's reaction, asked what kind of old man he was laughing at, because she had just been convicted and she thought there was nothing funny about it. Opilia asked what she should do now, and Sylvester, smiling, said that he himself wondered what his dear wife would do in such a situation. Then Opilia asked if he would offer his help in solving this problem. Sylvester explained that, unfortunately, it was Opilia who was invited to court, and she had to deal with it herself. Opilia got angry and asked if he hadn't just said that he would solve all her problems. The Duke, smiling, replied that it was just a joke and that he liked it when she got angry. Sylvester said he would get a good lawyer, and he thought they would only get away with the fine he would put on her account. Opilia thought it was better than prison after all. Opilia then asked in surprise if the aristocrats were ever fined, for she knew they tried to hide it in any way they could. and Sylvester confirmed her words, saying that pride always comes first for aristocrats, so Ophelia will be the first aristocrat to receive a fine as punishment. After carefully considering the whole situation, Ophelia planned that as soon as she rebuilt the shelter, everyone would immediately speak of her only from the good side and forget about her evil deeds. She wanted to create a virtuous image for herself, and if she becomes the first person to receive a fine, her reputation will be permanently destroyed. Therefore, Ophelia decided to act in a different way and play her main trump card. The next day, dressed in her best dress, she headed for an audience with the crown prince. This time, she was met in the imperial palace in a completely different way. The maids, bowing politely, offered her their assistance, and the valet loudly announced that the Duchess of Resin had arrived. Ophelia smiled sweetly and mentally noted that the attitude of the crown prince's servants had changed as soon as they received the letter with the Resin family seal. Although Ophelia did not want to remember that she had to beg her husband to write this letter, yet she did not regret having resorted to such actions, for they had played their part in the matter. Even the guard who insulted Ophelia last time politely bowed before the Duchess and, opening the door, offered to enter the drawing room of the imperial palace. Passing by the guard, on whose forehead a cold sweat broke out, Ophelia thought that this time she was very lucky, although fate never smiled on the real Ophelia from the novel. Throwing an angry look at the guard, Ophelia went inside the imperial drawing room. She immediately began to examine the interior of the room and noticed that it looked quite simple. Usually, special attention was paid to the living room when arranging it, because it was considered the face of the estate. And in this living room, to be honest, there was almost nothing at all. Ophelia began to wonder who was involved in the design of this living room, and thought that it must be the work of Flur, who was different from other aristocrats, and lived quite modestly without excessive pathos. Then Ophelia thought that maybe Flur didn't do it for nothing, but that she had specially separated herself from the other aristocrats in order to appear more innocent to the crown prince. Ophelia did not understand why exactly when she thought of Fleur, only some negative thoughts entered her head. Therefore, she decided not to think about that girl at all, and just in time heard the footsteps of the crown prince. Kaelin immediately said unkindly that he could not believe that he had to look at that hideous face again, because he did not even think that he would have to see it again so soon. Ophelia replied that she was also pleased to meet Kaelin, and she thought to herself that this fool does not yet know what awaits him, because she has a hidden secret weapon against him. The crown prince immediately offered to start the case and said that if she was going to ask him to withdraw the summons from the court, then let her immediately leave his palace. Ophelia decided to be patient, because in this matter she must have a cold mind, therefore, smiling, she only replied to Kaelin that his mood showed that he was serious. And then Ophelia suddenly added that this is exactly why she came to the crown prince. He, turning around, rudely said that he will not repeat it twice, and he refuses to withdraw his claim. The crown prince added that even if the whole world turns upside down, he is not going to withdraw his claim. Ophelia just calmly added that she was sorry about this. And then Ophelia reported that she had time to deliver the letter to the empress. And as soon as Kaelin heard this, he turned so sharply that he pushed a cup of tea that was on the table, and it spilled on the floor. The prince asked her how she knew, because after receiving the letter, he searched, but there were no clues to find how exactly it got there. Ophelia listened carefully to the prince and thought that she understood everything. It became clear to Ophelia that while the prince and his men were carefully studying the letter, a corresponding silence reigned in their relations. Kaelin immediately asked how she found the letter and where she stole it. Ophelia defiantly sat down in her chair and lowered her head, as if to say regretfully that she was upset that he actually thought she had stolen the letter. The girl added that how exactly the letter got into her hands is a completely different story, and asked the prince if he was interested in hearing it. Kaelin, losing his temper, shouted that of course it was. Ophelia already felt like a winner because she managed to make the crown prince emotional, so she reached for the candy and calmly opened the box. Ophelia unhurriedly opened the candy and looked at the crown prince. The girl said that there was actually another letter. The prince immediately asked if she had taken him with her. Ophelia calmly answered that the letter was not with her at the moment, and the crown prince could receive it only if he withdrew his summons from the court. Having said this, the girl slowly ate the candy. After thinking about something for a while, the crown prince said that he could not trust her because he had not seen this letter. Then Ophelia replied that in that case, let him think that the letter does not exist at all. Then Kaelin decided not to speak so harshly to Ophelia, because she might not see the second letter at all, and told her not to jump to conclusions. The crown prince finally decided to talk calmly with Opilia, and sitting down opposite her, offered her to set some ban if he still decided to withdraw his summons. Opilia agreed to listen to his terms. The crown prince said she would not leave the grounds of his estate for the next month, and he would withdraw the suit from court. Kaelin added that without her agreement to this condition, he is not going to withdraw the lawsuit because she still wants to avoid a lawsuit. So he suggested that she better reach some kind of compromise. Opilia was taken by surprise by such an offer, because she did not expect that she would have to sit at home for a whole month, because such grandiose plans for the construction of the shelter were waiting for her. But after a little consideration, Opilia suggested that the crown prince keep the fact that she would be under house arrest a secret, although she would comply with it. If Opilia avoids a trial, then sitting under house arrest, people will learn that the girl received a royal punishment, and this will become the main topic of gossip in aristocratic circles. That is why Opilia told the prince why she did not want the house arrest to be known. Kaelin looked at Opilia in surprise, and asked how long she had been concerned about the opinions of others. Opilia bowed her head and thought that Kaelin, like Sylvester, was very surprised by her behavior. Out loud, the girl simply said that she was worried about the opinion of others after one moment. After thinking it over, the prince agreed not to tell anyone about her house arrest. Then Opilia thanked him for his understanding and said that he would have to wait a month before receiving the letter. The crown prince shouted indignantly, asking why he had to wait a whole month for a letter. And Opilia, smiling, said in an innocent voice that she could not leave her estate to get him. Kaelin's facial expression immediately changed, and Opilia realized that he might be bursting with anger. Therefore, she added with a sweet smile on her face that unfortunately such are the terms of their contract. The tears in Ophilia's eyes spoke for themselves, and the prince realized that he had fallen on his own hook, forbidding her to leave the estate for a month, so he wondered how she had deftly tricked him. Opilia saw that the crown prince was simply mad with anger and thought that from now on he would hate her even more, so she decided not to pressure him anymore. In order to somehow support the upset Kaelin, Opilia said that she could share with him another valuable piece of information if it could cheer him up a bit. The crown prince immediately raised his head and looked at the young girl with a look full of hope. She timidly said that there was another letter from his mother. Opilia added that this was the third and last letter from the Empress, and this letter is hidden in the imperial palace. This news, like lightning in the middle of a clear sky, thundered over the whole room. The crown prince looked at the young girl and could not understand how it happened that Opilia knew about these letters. At that moment, he wished that anyone could share such a secret with him, but not her. Therefore, the crown prince directly asked Opilia how she managed to find out about the existence of letters from his mother, and he was especially interested in the fact, where she got the data, where they are. Opilia then bowed and said dreamily that the Empress herself had asked her to deliver these letters to the crown prince sometime in the future, so she was doing her bidding. Hearing this, the prince could hardly stand on his feet, because he could not believe that the Empress Margaret and Opilia were acquainted, and even more so that the mother had asked this very woman to deliver the letters to him. Opilia saw that she got into the heart of the crown prince with her news, so saying that they would see each other in a month, she went to the exit. And Kaelin looked after her for a long time. When Sylvester learned of his wife's return, he immediately went out to meet her, and said that the mere sight of her gave him a stirring in his chest, and he did not know what to do about it. And when the Duke approached Opilia, he said that she had to overcome such a difficult way to the imperial palace, and in addition, she also gladly accepted house arrest. These jokes on Sylvester's part angered Opilia, and she cried out, asking what was wrong with her act, for now the lawsuit was withdrawn and her story would not gain as much publicity if he kept his mouth shut. But Sylvester replied with a smile that no one had given her such promises on his part, and he was even more annoyed by the fact that the Duchess bowed her head to the crown prince. The Duke pondered and explained that there was a clear difference between the way subordinates followed the orders of the imperial court and accepted the orders of the prince, and all that was happening was very confusing to him. Opilia resented Sylvester's failure to praise her efforts again, and the man continued to say that it was impossible to turn back time and asked what she was going to do for a month, sitting at home. Opilia answered, asking who told him that she would stay at home, because she needed to visit some lands, check on the people, find out what the children wanted. Therefore, the month will pass unnoticed. Opilia said that she has a lot of work to do in order to open the orphanage on time, and no amount of house arrest will make her stay at home. Her stubborn spirit reminded Sylvester of Ophelia's past, and he said that he was very glad to hear her intentions, and especially the spirit with which she approached the arrest. Sylvester added that she should continue in the same spirit and do as the Duchess of Raisin should have done. Ophelia did not understand what he meant, so she asked him about it. Sylvester explained that Ophelia must obey neither him nor the crown prince, and must do whatever her heart desires. The young girl listened to his words with a sinking heart. Herzog added that they have only one life and she should live it as her heart tells her, and not listen to the advice of others, so as not to regret it in the future. Then Ophelia thought that perhaps all this was done by Sylvester, not for the sake of their family, but simply because the man does not want Ophelia to be tied to something and depend on something. His words struck Ophelia so much that she thought about her past life and became so worried that she began to tremble. The Duke immediately noticed her condition and asked what had happened. The girl pondered over his words and did not know if she could share her personal thoughts with him. Nevertheless, she decided to admit that she is simply afraid to make any important decisions. Ophelia added that it seems like living by her own laws is not so easy for her as she thought about it before. Of course, this was her cherished dream in the past life, and now she was afraid to make important decisions. Ophelia feared most of all that one day she might wake up again in a hospital bed and her life would be the same as before. From these thoughts, she began to be bothered by some anxiety more and more often. Then Sylvester came up to Ophelia and hugged her and said that she has nothing to fear because she is a duchess and no one will dare to touch her with a finger as long as he lives. She looked into his gray eyes, and deep down she wanted to believe him. But reason repeated to Ophelia to keep herself in her hands, because he is just a thief. The man continued to speak so that she would always remember that she was completely safe with him. Ophelia could not take her eyes off his gray eyes and sank more and more into them. At first glance, his words seemed sincere and kind to her, but somewhere deep down she understood that most likely he was just planning to use her and was probably already thinking about his steps in advance. Then she decided that no matter what Sylvester had in mind about her, and no matter what his intentions were, she would still think her own way and live the way she wanted. So the next morning, taking her maid with her, Ophelia decided to go out into the city and have a good look at what she could do to build her shelter. Ophelia decided to take the first step towards her dream. At that time, she had no idea that the very first day of house arrest would cause such big problems for her. Maid Irene obediently followed her mistress. She could not believe that she was taken to the city. After all, it was the first time since she became Ophelia's personal maid. Therefore, Irene pondered all the way how this happened, and was afraid to even believe that Ophelia did it without any malicious intentions, and expected some reason from her mistress. Irene couldn't take her eyes off Ophelia as she traded kindly with the fruit seller and complimented the woman a lot. The saleswoman offered Ophelia to try anything. All Irene could see before was how her ever-disgruntled landlady threatened to kill the girl immediately, or bury her alive in a grave, and stand there until Irene died forever. Irene was afraid to even enter Ophelia's room when the landlady was in a bad mood, but duties forced the girl to go to the Duchess's first call. As soon as she opened the door, a jug flew into her head. And even as a bloody Irene tried to staunch the bleeding by sitting on the floor, Ophelia continued to scream, asking why she hadn't come for so long after being summoned by the Duchess. Irene was very afraid of angering Ophelia even more, so she immediately fell on her knees and apologized for not being able to come earlier, because she was busy with other errands for the Duchess. It was Ophelia who was always in Irene's thoughts. Therefore, it was very difficult for the maid to believe that Ophelia, who had not hit her once in the last week, was next to her. Ophelia called to Irene and handed her a ripe orange. The shocked maid could not believe that Ophelia was now smiling at her and also treating her to a delicious fruit. Meanwhile, Ophelia looked at the houses on the street and estimated how much they would be suitable for opening a shelter there. They had good accommodation, close to the main street. Ophelia then decided that to begin with, she needed to find one boy, who was currently 15 years old. In the future, he was bound to become a hero of the empire and a skilled knight. In the original story, Flur saw this young man stealing bread from the bakery. She took pity on him and took him to her shelter. But Ophelia knew that she and the boy could not meet in this way. Ophelia knew that the thief would never repeat the plot of the main character, so she hoped that when she opened the shelter, that boy would come to him himself, and that's how they would meet him. Therefore, Opilia decided to build a shelter not far from the bakery, and thinking about it, muttered under her breath, which surprised the maid Irene. Opilia asked why the maid was so surprised. The girl replied that the landlady had never thought aloud before, but when Irene heard about the construction of the shelter, she said that it was a good idea. The maid hastened to apologize that she doesn't know anything about the construction of shelters, so you don't know what else to add. And Opilia wondered why her maid was so tense. Then Opilia looked at the position in which the maid was talking to her and understood everything. After all, the girl was simply tense from the fact that she was afraid of receiving an unexpected blow from Opilia. Opilia looked at the poor girl and said that although it was already too late, she still wanted to promise never to harm the maid, and all the more to punish her physically somehow. Opilia extended her little finger to the maid, inviting her to touch her finger as well and seal their promise. But Irene could not believe that her evil landlady was capable of such a thing. Opilia expected that the girl would gladly support such an idea of making friends, but instead, the maid was frightened and asked Opilia what had happened to her recently. Irene explained that it all started the day Opilia returned home soaked to the bone after she disappeared from the family estate for several days. The maid began to worry about her mistress, because after her return that night, Opilia began to behave radically differently, as if she had become a completely different person. The maid also told about the meeting with the designers, when Opilia was surprisingly polite, and now that Opilia has decided to build a shelter, Irene doesn't know what to think of her landlady at all. Therefore, the maid asked with concern whether Opilia had been ill recently and offered to invite a doctor to her for an examination because she was worried about her mistress no matter what. Opilia explained that she simply reconsidered everything and decided to live better. After all, she has a bright future ahead of her. Opilia extended her hand to the girl, and she, waiting for a blow, covered her face with her hands. But Opilia simply tied a bow on her cloak, which had already come untied, and gently said that it was difficult for Irene to believe it yet, and she did not trust her. The Duchess added that she pleads guilty. Opilia said that this time she was serious and promised the girl never to hurt anyone again. Opilia added that she swears by her family's last name. The confused maid blinked her eyes and did not understand what was happening here, and Opilia added that they had to hurry because before the end of the day they had to visit a few more places. Looking at the buildings, Opilia realized that it was much more complicated than she thought. It would be better if there were more pictures in the book so that she could immediately recognize the building she needed. And Opilia was even more worried that someone would recognize her on the very first day of house arrest, so she carefully hid her face behind a dark cloak and carefully walked among passers-by. There were so many people that Opilia, stepping forward, did not notice how her maid lagged behind her. Irene tried to catch up with Opilia and tripped over a passerby and fell to the ground. Irene's fall hurt her and she screamed. Opilia heard the voice of her maid. The Duchess turned and began to search the maid with her eyes, trying to understand what had happened. At last, Ophilia's gaze met the maid sitting on the ground. Opilia shouted for Irene to quickly catch up with her. Then Opilia noticed a carriage speeding down the road at breakneck speed. Opilia saw that this carriage was headed straight for her maid, so she immediately shouted for Irene to run quickly. That girl was so shocked and confused that she remained sitting in place. Then Ophilia's gaze saw a stout young man with green hair running out of the crowd. The boy looked 15 years old, and Opilia understood that he was a future hero. There were seconds left before the collision. Irene was already white in anticipation of her last moments of life, so she covered her face with her hands and saw how her entire life flashed before her eyes. But the young man deftly managed to catch the girl and threw her away from the hooves of the mad horse a second before the accident. The whole crowd, holding their breath, watched the events unfolding here. The young man immediately apologized to the maid for pushing her and asked how she was feeling. The maid replied that she was fine and thanked her for saving her. Opilia watched the rescue of her maid from the crowd and thanked God that she was all right. But she was even more glad that she had the pleasure of meeting the boy she was looking for so much. Opilia also ran to her maid, and on the way began to ask how she was. Irene did not expect that Opilia would be so concerned about her condition, so she became emotional and cried. Approaching the young people, Opilia also thanked the boy for saving him and asked if everything was fine with him. Opilia was glad to meet Theo and was not going to miss this chance. And then Opilia noticed that the young man's knee was covered in blood and asked with horror if he was injured. In her mind, she worried that he would not have a fracture and that he would somehow be able to walk. The guy said it was just a small scratch, but Opilia insisted that the bleeding should be stopped immediately, and taking out a handkerchief, began to provide first aid. Opilia said that the wound needed to be treated to prevent any infection, and told Theo that she would pay for the treatment. The young man nodded and thanked him for his concern. Opilia did not have time to think who could afford to drive at such a speed on a crowded street, when an angry man ran out of the carriage and shouted, asking why he stopped so suddenly. Opilia looked at the man, who began to call the children names, because he saw that they were sitting in the road of his carriage, and cursed him because he almost fell out of the carriage because of these scoundrels. Then Opilia decided to intervene and, standing up, asked the man why he did not ask how the victims were feeling, because people could have died because of him, noting that nobles do not behave like that. The man became even more angry and began to insult Opilia, saying what kind of old man she is interfering in his conversation, and whether she is all right with her mind that she dared to deny him. Opilia realized that one word was not enough here, so she called out to the people gathered around them to immediately call security. But none of the people moved. Then Opilia turned and looked at the people who were standing with their heads down and couldn't understand why they weren't calling the guards. Meanwhile, the man began to laugh and asked if she knew who he was. The man shouted that he was Ilbert Ride, the second son of the Ride family, and by mutual agreement he was a vassal of the Regan family. Therefore, none of those present dared to say a word to him. The man continued to mock Opilia and threateningly said that if she dared to cross the border, very soon there would be no trace of her in the dark street. But Opilia, having carefully listened to Ilbert's pompous threats, began to laugh. He got even angrier and asked what old man she was laughing at. The girl, apologizing, explained that she couldn't hold back. Opilia only added that it seems that Duke Rhys made a big mistake when he recruited people from the lowest class to be his subjects. Having said this, the girl continued to smile into Ilbert's eyes. The people in the crowd heard the woman speaking boldly to Ilbert and began to whisper as well, asking how a noble could behave so lowly, and also adding that everyone knew what a scoundrel he was. The man, of course, heard what was being said about him in the crowd. He is just mad that he has to listen to such humiliations from common people because of these two teenagers who were in his way. Therefore, Ilbert decided to teach them a lesson and shouted that these two scumbags, who behaved so arrogantly, would have to receive a decent punishment. Opilia watched with a sinking heart as he took out his knife. Ilbert swung his knife at the young lad and Irene the maid, and cried out that they would rather be crushed by a carriage than meet their death by his cold weapon. The maid, who almost went to the other world for the second time in the last half hour, closed her eyes. Theo watched as the knife approached his body, then suddenly bumped into something that blocked his path. When Theo saw what Iralda's knife hit, he almost lost consciousness, because it was the hand of the woman who had just given him medical care and was worried about his condition. Ilbert did not expect that anyone would prevent him from dealing with these commoners, so he opened his eyes and looked at the brave woman who blocked those worthless teenagers. Ophelia's silver hair stuck out from under the cloak, and then Ilbert recognized her as the wife of Duke Resson, because her silver hair and emerald eyes stuck in his memory for a long time, because the girl's beauty resembled the charm of a fairy. But Ilbert was even more frightened by the stories that circulated about Ophelia's anger and her dark magic. Therefore, he immediately fell to his knees, put the knife aside, and asked for forgiveness. Opilia guessed that Ilbert recognized her, so there was no point in hiding her identity in the future. The maid ran to the landlady and shouted that Opilia was injured because she saw her holding a bloody hand. Opilia asked Theo if he was okay, and he immediately started apologizing. Opilia replied that there was no point in apologizing, and she was glad that it was only a small scratch. Theo looked at the pretty woman who so bravely defended him, and he couldn't even imagine who she was. The boy saw that the nobleman who recognized her was trembling with fear and crawling on his knees in front of her. Theo understood that this woman must be a very terrible person, if even Ilbert was frightened when he recognized who she was. But for the guy, this woman was like an angel who came down from heaven. When the uproar around the young people died down, the people went about their daily business. But for Opilia that day, new problems began. At home, she was met by an angry Sylvester, who demanded from her an explanation as to how she had thought of getting into such trouble on the first day of her arrest. He said that she did not describe everything to him that way. Opilia looked at her husband in surprise and could not understand what else she could do to make him so angry, and he shouted, asking if she didn't do it all on purpose. Opilia just blinked her eyes and once again wondered what she had done wrong. The girl was waiting for an explanation from Sylvester, and therefore silently looked into his eyes. After that incident, returning home, the maid watched with tears in her eyes as Opilia deftly stopped the bleeding and kept asking the landlady if she was all right. The maid said that she was already very surprised because she could never even think that Opilia would do something for another person. So today, Opilia made a strong impression on Irene. Irene reminded them that they were under house arrest, and Opilia, before returning home, addressed all the witnesses and said that if anyone spoke about this incident, she would curse his entire family. Irene added that earlier it was difficult for her to believe Ophilia's words, and after today, everything changed. Now the maid can believe that her mistress has completely changed for the better. That girl was tormented by her conscience. Should she receive such kind words from the maid if all the actions were planned? The only thing she wanted was for Theo to stay alive. But even more, Opilia wanted people to stop being afraid of her and start trusting her. She believed that when this happens, her life will become much easier and she will be able to live peacefully. Therefore, Opilia smiled at the maid and thanked her for such kind words. Opilia was actually pleased that at least someone appreciated her efforts, and then she realized that she did all this for a reason. Opilia told the maid that they should go home at once before it got dark, because they had had too many adventures today, and they should have a good rest. But the next morning, Opilia, having read the headlines of the local press, was simply shocked, because there it was said that Opilia had saved the boy, and the question was raised whether she had become a different person. While reading the press, Opilia did not notice how Sylvester came in. He began to applaud his wife, saying that she had become the main topic for discussion, and congratulated her on such a grand appearance in public. Opilia said that it is enough to add fuel to the fire, because she is not sweet anyway. Sylvester, smiling, asked if this was not what she wanted, leaving the rest with the estate on the first day. But Opilia explained that she was not going to risk her reputation, because her life is much more valuable than all the silly gossip that is discussed in aristocratic circles. Opilia explained that the boy saved Irene, so if Sylvester's maid and the boy died that day, the Reason family would be talked about in a bad light. Opilia added that even if she opened the shelter, it would not help them wash the reputation of their family, so she decided to sacrifice herself for the sake of the honor of the Reason family. Sylvester said that now he understood everything, because if she answered that she did it out of kindness, then he would be disappointed in Opilia. But now he is sure that his wife is the same as before. Sylvester said he had to go on urgent business, and finally added that he had no doubt she would cause them more trouble. But Opilia denied that everything would be the other way around. When the door slammed behind her husband, Opilia breathed a sigh of relief and decided that this time she was lucky to have a slight fright. After looking at the pile of newspapers, she decided to use it to her advantage. Meanwhile, Sylvester went to the dungeon where Ilbert had already been urgently taken. As soon as the Duke entered the cell, he threw the man several meters away with one blow. Ilbert, coming to his senses, knelt before the Duke and greeted him. But Sylvester was angry, like the devil himself, so he immediately began to shout at Ilbert, asking if he had really hurt his wife. Ilbert began to make excuses, explaining that he had no idea that Duke Sylvester's wife was in front of him, because if he had known, he would have immediately thrown himself at her feet. But Sylvester was just adjusting the glove on his hand. Sylvester then menacingly asked Ilbert what his guesses were as to why the Duke had been silent all this time. The Duke immediately threw out several options of possible answers so that Ilbert would not strain his brain. Sylvester said that the Ride family constantly spent the joint money, thinking that it would all go unnoticed. But the Duke knows for sure about these crimes. Sylvester asked Ilbert if he really believed that all his crimes would go unnoticed, because he also knew that his family members were involved in illegal business. The Duke also listed all the wrongdoings of the Ride family and noted exactly how much wealth they had amassed thanks to their fraudulent machinations. And the most important thing is that representatives of the Ride family used all these illegally obtained funds to sneak up on the Crown Prince. Therefore, the Duke was even more angry with the raids. The Duke solemnly announced that he was withdrawing all support from the Ride family. These words went through Ilbert like a knife through his heart, because he understood that without this help they are nothing. The Duke also added that he would issue an order for Ilbert's banishment, and that his foot would never set foot on these lands again. Sylvester knew that this was where Ilbert enjoyed popularity and abused it. For Ilbert, it was like a death sentence, because he perfectly understood that in foreign lands without financial support, he would simply beg on the street. Ilbert immediately began to appeal to His Highness and ask that Sylvester listen to him and forgive him. He crawled behind him on his knees and grabbed his legs, begging for mercy. But Sylvester turned sharply, grabbed Ilbert by the throat, and ominously said that he should not have contacted Sylvester because now he will have to live differently, and it is possible that in the next world. Dashing out of the cell, Sylvester told the guard to follow instructions. The guard bowed and said that he understood everything, and the Duke quickly moved on. Stepping quickly, Sylvester reflected that everything that has value he achieves by any means, and what is already his, he never lets go. This was his life credo. Therefore, recalling the image of Opilia, Sylvester said that no one should touch what belongs to him and can never touch. Saying this, Sylvester quickly moved on. The day when Theo first appeared at the Reason Manor seemed to be quite sunny. The boy carefully looked at the jewels of the house, wondering if it was really made of gold. Theo never in his life could even imagine that one day he would find himself in the Duchy of Reason. He was met by maids who offered to take his luggage, but he refused. The boy wondered why he was called to this incredibly beautiful mansion. Then a woman approached the confused young man, who greeted the boy, and said that he had finally arrived. Opilia said she was looking forward to their meeting, and the boy, speechless, looked at the woman who saved him from the aristocrat in Khrushchev a few days ago. When Opilia was dressed in a precious dress, she looked like a queen in the midst of this luxurious interior, and the boy could not utter a word from delight. Opilia immediately offered refreshments from the road and placed several desserts in front of Theo. The Duchess said that after trying all of them, he must decide which is the tastiest for him. Opilia watched carefully as Theo timidly ordered the desserts and thought to herself that from now on she would feed and worry about him, so he should heel like a cat in butter. The Duchess poked a piece of strawberry on her fork and asked Theo to try this dessert, because the fruit for him had been brought in only this morning. Sylvester suddenly entered the dining room, who did not expect to see a homeless person at the table next to the Duchess. So he shouted menacingly, asking what this guy was doing here. Opilia also did not expect to see Sylvester, who returned from work earlier and was surprised to say that the beloved came earlier today, and Theo guiltily greeted the owner of the estate. Sylvester glared at his wife and waited for an explanation. Opilia hastened to tell that this guy had saved Irene from the carriage and that's why she invited him to visit. Opilia remarked that Sylvester should have warned her that he would be back early. Then they would have eaten together. The Duchess said they still needed to discuss something. Opilia smiled and said that if she explained everything, they could now have dinner together and invited Sylvester to join them. But the Duke sharply replied that he did not agree to this. The boy guiltily lowered his head and listened to the arguments of the owners of the estate. Opilia, meanwhile, asked what Sylvester was going to do with the boy, and whether he was going to throw him out into the street. Sylvester angrily asked why she couldn't feed him later when they had dinner together, and asked how she could even invite guests to the house without talking to him. Looking at the poor boy, Sylvester remarked that Opilia could have taken care of the young man's appearance and dressed him better, because he was not at all up to their level. Opilia did not understand why her husband was so indignant that she had invited this guy to the house, and decided not to push the situation further, because there was already tension in the air. Therefore, Opilia apologized to the young man, said that she and her husband needed to talk alone, and asked him to wait a little for her in another room. Theo replied that he understood everything perfectly, and went with the maid to another room. Opilia noticed that the boy was very upset, because he witnessed their argument. Opilia was simply furious that all her efforts to make a good impression on the young man were in vain, because Sylvester had intervened in their conversation. The Duke remarked that it was not a problem at all, and Opilia shouted indignantly that it was a problem, because he always behaves rudely and creates uncomfortable situations, as if doing it on purpose. Sylvester replied that it was Opilia who was behaving strangely, because how did it even occur to her to bring a child from the nursery and sit her at their family table and taste all kinds of delicacies? Opilia objected, exclaiming that it was this young man who saved the life of their worker, so he had good intentions because when he saved her, the boy did not know that the girl served in the Resin family. Therefore, the Duchess added that she saw nothing wrong in being friendly to their savior, but Sylvester only indignantly asked in what sense she did not see anything wrong. Approaching Opilia, the Duke asked her if she was doing all this on purpose, because her jokes had gone too far. The Duke's mood was bad, so she did not know what to answer him. While Opilia was mulling over different answers in her head, Sylvester added that she had lied a lot, so he didn't believe her at all. The girl considered where exactly she had made a mistake and what Sylvester did not like. That's why she asked him what exactly she lied to him about, because she doesn't understand what he's talking about. Sylvester looked into her eyes and understood that the girl could not guess what she was talking about, so he explained that this child she was talking about was quite old. Sylvester explained that when she told him about the child, he thought that the boy was 7 or 8 years old, but when he saw him, he realized that he was a handsome adult young man. Sylvester invited the girl to think about how it would look from the outside that she brought the young man from the slums, and he now lives with them in their family estate. Opilia suggested that he speak clearly if he wanted to say something and not in some riddles, and Sylvester told her to forget about dinner, because he would be having dinner in his room. The next morning, as Opilia was getting dressed, she said that today was just a wonderful day. The maid reported that she helped the young man take a bath and change his clothes. Opilia then asked the maid what she thought of this young fellow. Irene, too, dreamily began to tell that he is quite cute, and maybe after some time he will become a real handsome man. The Duchess noted that she had asked the maid for her opinion of Theo's character. Then Irene, blushing, said that she was just grateful to the boy for saving her, so she thinks about him almost every day. And then the maid dreamily added that he seemed to her to be quite nice, and noted that the boy was a good match for Opilia. After her words, Opilia remarked that it was probably only because he was innocent. The maid realized that she had spoken too much, so she immediately ran after her and apologized to the landlady for her bold statement. Irene added that possible Opilia did not understand everything so well. But Opilia put her hand on the maid's shoulder and told her not to worry so much and that everything was fine. And then, leaving the room, she added that the guy was really innocent. The maid curiously asked why he was so special then, and Opilia reported that it was 100% that many saw this very boy in the carriage of the Reason family. Opilia was convinced that rumors would quickly spread about how the Duchess saved the child from death and invited the Duke to the house. Everyone knew that such gossip spread with lightning speed. Therefore, people will soon start saying that Opilia actually sacrificed herself in order to save the boy from Khrushchev. And very soon, everyone will have to believe that the rumors are the truth. Opilia decided that she would use this situation to her advantage, and this was the best opportunity to get rid of the stigma of a thief, so the girl went to Theo's room. Opilia asked from the doorway whether the boy had been waiting for her for a long time, and he replied guiltily that he himself had only recently come to the room, so Opilia did not make him wait at all. When Opilia looked at the boy, a real handsome man was standing in front of her. His yellow eyes, accentuated by green hair, captivated the interlocutor's gaze. Opilia decided to immediately dot the ands about the situation at dinner and said that her husband had said terrible things, so she apologized for him to the boy. The boy replied that he understood everything and that the Duke's reaction was generally logical. Opilia breathed a sigh of relief and invited Theo to move on to the conversation he had been brought to the estate for. The young man gathered his spirit and said that before they began the conversation, Opilia should take something from him. The young man held out the scroll and asked Opilia to accept the gift. Opilia was both happy and surprised at the same time, so she asked the boy if this gift was really intended for her, because in fact, she was not used to such pleasant surprises. On the way to Ophilia's estate, the young man was completely immersed in his thoughts. He thought about all the gossip he had heard from those around him about Opilia. His landlady scared the boy that this witch wanted to lure him into her lair and sacrifice him to demons, because why would she need a boy without aristocratic roots so urgently? The boy, holding a mop in his hands, pondered over the landlady's words because they made logical sense. Then he thought about their truthfulness, and the woman shouted for the boy to fulfill his duties faster. Then the boy thought and thought, if it turns out to be true that Opilia lured him to use in her rituals, he didn't care, because he was ready to sacrifice himself for her sake. Opilia looked touched at the young man who took care of the gift for her and asked if it was really intended for her. She still could not believe that the young man thought of her. Theo bowed his head guiltily and said that it was nothing special. He just feels uncomfortable that Opilia got into such an uncomfortable and terrible situation because of him. The guy explained that the envelope contained ground herbs that he had collected with his own hands because he had no money for the ingredients. He noted that maybe the lady already has good medicine. The boy now felt uncomfortable that he had given such junk to such a famous person and added that if she threw them away he would not be offended at all, because he was sure that Opilia had better medicines than these. Opilia carefully listened to the young man's explanation, silently turned around and went to the window. He did not know what she was going to do and asked Madame about her intentions. At first the boy thought that Opilia would throw these herbs out the window, and he saw how she unrolled the bundle, and taking out the herbs, began to smear her wound with them. Opilia smiled and said that she liked such a gift. Therefore, she thanked the boy for his concern, and he watched in confusion as she rubbed the medicine into her hand. The boy was shocked and realized that he thought in vain that Opilia was a witch and wanted to sacrifice him because she easily used unproven herbs from his hands. After that, Opilia offered to return to the conversation, and they sat down comfortably at the table with cups of tea poured over them. She asked the boy if he knew why she invited him to her estate. The boy reached for a delicious cookie that he had never tasted in his everyday life and replied that he had no idea why he was invited to the Reason family. Then Opilia said that she was planning to build a shelter for the homeless, and that walk during which they met was also part of her work. And then Opilia added that she would like Theo to stay and be the face of the shelter, if he didn't mind, of course. That guy, confused, told Opilia that he was nobody. Opilia thought that the boy had too low self-esteem, but she knew that his future was just incredible, so she took his hands and told him not to worry about it, because he had earned her trust. But the boy did not agree to any of them. Opilia offered to stay at the estate for a few days and think carefully about this offer. Now she was thinking about how to persuade the boy to do this. Opilia walked down the corridor and mumbled under her breath that this guy simply could not refuse because her whole plan to build a shelter was based on his consent. She did not even notice how a man approached her from behind and called her. Turning around, Opilia saw the Duke's nervous aide and asked him what had happened. Neil explained that he was looking for Opilia, and she asked, surprised, why? The girl was used to the fact that the Duke's assistant was always looking for only Sylvester, and he never cared about her. Neil couldn't catch his breath because he was running so fast to Opilia. He quickly replied that he is here. Opilia did not understand what was being said and asked who she was. Neil then explained that His Highness had arrived at the estate. The fact that Opilia was shocked is nothing to say, so she quickly went to the Crown Prince and said that she was surprised that the Crown Prince had come to visit so unexpectedly. Opilia smiled and was in the mood for a pleasant conversation, but the Crown Prince angrily threw some paper at Ophilia's feet and shouted that everything should go according to her plan. Opilia asked what plan he was talking about. Kaelin shouted that she should not be a fool because he perfectly understood what was being said, and he added, asking if she was happy that she managed to get what she wanted. That young girl just blinked her eyes and looked at the Crown Prince, waiting for him to finally explain why he came here. Then Kaelin shouted that the Emperor himself was looking for her. The Emperor of the Empire was Casentri Villas, a powerful man who never compromised his interests, and the entire aristocratic society feared and respected him. The Emperor had been familiar with Opilia for a long time, thanks to the rumors that flooded the entire empire and reached the capital. But they were all about the fact that Opilia is a virtuoso thief. The Emperor knew Opilia not only as a thief, because he remembered the past Empress Margaret, and how the Empress sincerely loved Opilia and spent all her free time with her. But after the death of Margaret, Opilia began her crimes. But today's events spoke of Opilia as a completely different person, and the Emperor decided to find out what the matter was. This news was so shocking for Opilia that she almost lost consciousness. Of course, she had no idea why the Emperor wanted to see her, but it was clear that something interesting was waiting for her. Sylvester, meanwhile, was walking along the corridor without suspecting anything. He decided today to deal with the things that had accumulated recently, because Ophilia's adventures knocked him out of his work schedule. Unexpectedly, the Duke was overtaken by the maid, who reported that Sylvester was wanted by Neil's assistant. The Duke immediately understood, looking at the expression on the maid's face, that the matter was urgent. The Duke asked what had happened, although he already guessed that Opilia was involved here. The maid reported that the Crown Prince had arrived at the estate, and the Duchess went to talk to him at the moment. The Crown Prince, meanwhile, decided not to hide that he knew everything, and told Opilia that she had left the estate under house arrest, trying to hide her face. Kaelin continued to tell that at the most crucial moment, Opilia still stole her identity and gained people's trust. It was these news that reached His Highness. Considering Kaelin's words, Opilia decided that there was nothing wrong with that. After all, when she meets the emperor, she can enlist his support and thereby avoid her terrible end. Therefore, Opilia decided that she would be able to free herself from both of these men even faster than she had imagined before. Just thinking about it brought a satisfied smile to her face. Meanwhile, the prince looked at Opilia and was simply maddened by the way she behaved. With that evil smile, Opilia looked even more terrifying, and Kaelin decided that his guess was correct. Therefore, the crown prince immediately decided to bring Opilia down from heaven to earth and said that she should rejoice early, because he would make every effort to ensure that her meeting with the emperor did not take place. Of course, the young girl was upset that Kaelin could interfere with her meeting, so she asked him if not every inhabitant of their empire had the right to receive the emperor. But the crown prince noted that only those people who have a good heart and pure intentions are admitted to the emperor, so Opilia has nothing to even dream of an audience with his highness. Then Opilia sharply replied that Kaelin himself did not fall under this description, because he personally brought proof that her intentions were transparent, because she saved the maid and the boy from the Krushka from danger. The crown prince shouted that he personally doubted that her intentions were pure, and most likely Opilia had set it all up on purpose to mislead people and get an opportunity to meet the emperor. The crown prince was already very angry and could not control his emotions. Then Opilia thought that it would be quite difficult for her to talk to this narrow-minded telephone. Meanwhile, the crown prince became so angry that he grabbed Ophilia's hand and squeezed it painfully. The young girl did not know how to react to such actions of Kaelin, so she screamed because her hand started to hurt a lot. The crown prince held Ophilia's hand and shouted that he knows what she really is, so there is no need to play comedy in front of him, and she can remove the mask of a good and innocent duchess. Opilia was generally shocked by what was happening, so she shouted what kind of old man he allows himself to touch her, and that he is talking nonsense about her intentions when he does not understand anything about it. Opilia thought that the crown prince must have thought she was going to hit him because she was so angry. Meanwhile, the prince who was holding her hand saw that the bandage slipped from Ophilia's hand. The crown prince stopped and let go of Ophilia's hand. He was surprised that the duchess had a fresh wound on her body and asked where she was from. Opilia shouted angrily that he could learn about it from the newspaper he had just brought. But Kaelin refused to believe it, so he laughed that Opilia had to even injure herself to make the spectacle she put on more believable, so that he would believe this lie. The hereditary principal continued to laugh that the aristocrat had scratches on her body. But Opilia, not going to tolerate his mockery, shouted, asking who was interested in any ranks. Opilia boldly looked into the eyes of the crown prince, and pointing to her scar, said that it was a mark of dignity because she saved the child. And that's all that matters for now. These words struck the crown prince in the very heart, and he wondered for a moment whether he really didn't hear it all, because he couldn't believe that Opilia could say such words. The prince looked at the young woman who spoke so boldly to him and proved that her intentions were actually sincere and she only wanted to protect the young men who were in mortal danger. In the thoughts of the prince, it was as if an angel and a demon entered into a duel. The angel told Kaelin to soberly assess the situation, and weighing all the arguments, you can believe that Opilia has really changed. And the demon may have whispered to the crown prince that if he loses his vigilance, Opilia will definitely take advantage of this situation and stick a knife in his back. He really didn't want to be cheated. And when Opilia wanted to leave, the crown prince stopped her and asked why she did not answer the letter he sent her. Opilia asked in surprise which letter it was about. Then Kaelin approached Opilia in a shelter and said in a threatening tone that if she did not want any more problems in the future, then she should not take a single step from her estate, as they had agreed on before. The crown prince threatened to sentence her to death if she disobeyed him. The girl mockingly replied that she was very scared. And then she held out her finger and said that she promised him to keep the deal. The prince took his hand away from Opilia as if from a leper and shouted that she should not touch him. Then Opilia noticed that he was the first to grab her hand so hard that it still hurts. The crown prince began to say something to Opilia. When she told him to continue, Kaelin quickly turned around and told her to forget about it as he prepared to leave. But before the crown prince had time to take a couple of steps, the door to the garden opened and a nervous Sylvester rushed in. He shouted as he went, calling his wife by name. When the two men looked at each other, Sylvester immediately asked what brought his highness to their estate. The prince replied that according to his status, he did not have to ask anyone to come to visit. Sylvester noted that no one can come to his estate in the absence of special circumstances, but he understands that Kaelin is not a simple man, so for the first time he will close his eyes to it. The crown prince haughtily remarked that he didn't need the duke's permission at all, because he was going to leave his estate anyway, especially since they have already talked to his wife. Opilia watched intently as the two men clarified their relationship and decided not to interfere in the men's quarrels. Then the crown prince offered Opilia to confirm his words. The young girl timidly replied that the prince was right, and the prince, when he was already leaving through the door, showing his little finger, reminded Opilia to remember and never violate the terms of their agreement. Also, the crown prince said in a more threatening tone that next time he would not spare her if she violated house arrest or any other arrangements on their part. Having said this, the crown prince came out and slammed the door loudly. Opilia looked after Kalina and thought about their last conversation and how the hereditary principal after her felt about her. Sylvester immediately looked sternly at Opilia and waited for an explanation. That girl continued to be silent. Then the Duke noticed that the wound on her hand was red. He forgot his anger and quickly approached her. As soon as the Duke was near the young girl, he gently took her hands and examined the red scar from the recent events. Sylvester asked why she didn't tell him anything about her injury. Opilia replied that it happened when she was protecting Theo and Irene from an angry man. Sylvester then noted that she had told him that she would never sacrifice herself for others. Opilia explained that at that moment she had no other choice, because the man had drawn his sword and it was so dangerous that Theo could have died if she had not intervened in time. Sylvester noted that he should call a doctor for a detailed examination of the wound and the appointment of appropriate treatment. But Opilia replied that there was no need to call the doctor and everything was fine with her. Opilia explained that her wound is not that deep, and if this wound will heal on its own, there will definitely be a scar. And when someone notices him, he will understand that she is not like other nobles. But for the girl herself, it was proof that her physical body is in perfect order, and she is even ready to sacrifice herself for the sake of others. Which, of course, was not the case in her past life. The girl did not want the wound to disappear and heal without a trace, because she did not want to forget that this scar symbolized her full life, which she wanted to live at her discretion. Sylvester listened attentively to the young girl and silently thought about something. When she finished her story, he said he hadn't expected to hear such far-reaching plans for an ordinary wound. Herzog said that she probably wanted to show her scar at every opportunity to remind people of her brave act, just as she wanted to use this young man to make people believe in her good intentions. The Duke remarked that even he would not have thought of such a thing, and then suddenly asked what she had promised the crown prince. Opilia replied that she had promised to abide by house arrest. Sylvester wondered if she would really comply with house arrest, and Opilia replied that she could not promise anything else, because the prince was ready to cut off her head. Suddenly Opilia reminded Sylvester of the promise that the Duke himself had made to her, and when the Duke asked to remember which one, Opilia explained that he had promised to pay money for each letter from the crown prince. Duke guiltily asked if he should pay her right now. Then Opilia replied that of course the promises must be fulfilled, and if they had already agreed on it, then he should pay her immediately. Sylvester noticed that the wife had become obsessed with money and agreed to deal with the payment very soon with the help of his assistant Neil, who would pay her in full. Sylvester then asked if that was all Opilia wanted to tell him. Opilia mysteriously answered that there was something else, and unexpectedly added that the emperor himself was looking after her. Sylvester rubbed his chin thoughtfully and remarked that it was even a good thing, although he was actually quite surprised at first. Then the Duke asked to be informed if the emperor invited her to his place. Opilia asked in surprise why he needed to say this, and whether he wanted to go with her to an audience with His Highness. Sylvester replied that of course he would go with his wife. Opilia immediately understood that Sylvester's intentions are obvious, because he always pursues his useful goals, which is why he wants to go with her. Opilia thought she would be more at ease with Sylvester. That girl decided not to agree right away, so she haughtily said that she could easily go to the emperor herself, because she did not want Sylvester to distract His Majesty's attention. Sylvester explained that it will be extremely difficult for the girl to communicate with the emperor, because the character of His Highness is quite difficult. But Opilia replied that her character was not a gift either. Then Sylvester offered to pay the girl good money for taking him with her. Opilia smiled and replied that it was a rather small bet, and suggested that he think better. Sylvester noted that it was now much more difficult to agree with Opilia. The young girl, smiling, replied that it was quite natural because now she can do so much by herself. The next morning, as soon as Ophelia opened her eyes, she immediately decided that she had already succeeded in partially fulfilling her plan, and the girl realized that Kaylin's ban was not as terrible as she imagined. Ophelia immediately went to the window and quickly opened the curtains. Seeing that the weather turned out to be quite sunny today, the girl said it out loud, and the maid suddenly appeared next to her. In fact, the estate of the Raisin family was incredibly huge. It was so large that no matter how much I walked, it was simply impossible to get around it in a day. Ophelia thought that one could even get lost inside. Therefore, for her, every day in this estate was like in a wonderland. The estate itself was a historical place, and there were treasures all around, as if in a museum. The young girl was surrounded by many subjects of culture and a whole bunch of everything that could be studied. Therefore, every time she went somewhere, it was like a trip for her, where she could learn something new. Going for a walk, Ophelia told Irene that yesterday she was in the East Wing, the day before yesterday, in the West. So today she decided to visit the annex, which was located to the north of the estate. As soon as Irene heard about the extension, she cried out in fear, and Ophelia asked the maid what kind of reaction it was and whether it was possible to go there. The maid immediately noticed that Ophelia could go wherever she wanted. But Ophelia replied that Irene never learned to lie, so she asked her to tell the truth. The maid said that the northern annex was Duke Sylvester's personal property. Irene added that the Duke had forbidden anyone but him to enter there. Therefore, all the servants are afraid to even approach that annex, lest they incur Sylvester's wrath. Irene said that even if one of the servants passed by the outbuildings, Sylvester was simply furious. And since he is like a demon in anger, no one dared to anger him once more. After saying this, Irene smiled and suggested that Ophelia visit the West Annex today, because it was quite an interesting city that had a large collection of rare paintings. Ophelia replied that now that she knows the entire history of the Northern Annex, she must go there. And when Irene asked why, the girl answered, to anger her pious husband. Not even an hour had passed when Ophelia was already standing in front of the annex and examining the area around it. The girl immediately noticed that the area looked as if no one had been here for a long time. Ophelia didn't even think that there was such a place in the estate that looked like an abandoned, haunted house. The Duke was obsessed with cleanliness, so she could not understand where such a dirty place had come from. After thinking a little outside, Ophelia decided that she would find the answer to this question only when she went inside. Approaching the door, she felt terrible, but still the girl opened the door. It was so dusty inside the annex that Ophelia covered her nose with a handkerchief even at first, because it was difficult to breathe, and it was quite surprising considering the fact that the entire estate was sparkling clean. Ophelia noticed the stairs to the second floor and immediately decided to go there. The girl noticed that the inside was even dirtier than the outside, although the layout of the annex was the same as the others. Having walked a few meters on the second floor, Ophelia began to wonder what could be so important here that Sylvester did not allow anyone to even pass by this annex. Then Ophelia noticed a picture and came closer to see who it was. A very beautiful woman with black hair was looking at the girl from there. The young girl was completely focused on this picture and did not even notice how someone's steps were approaching from behind. Then Sylvester's voice called the girl, calling her by name. Turning, Ophelia saw an angry man who had overtaken her up the stairs. The girl immediately understood that this would not be easy for her, and Sylvester maliciously noted that there is a limit to everything in Ophelia's actions. The Duke angrily asked the girl why she had come here. Ophelia explained as calmly as possible that she simply got bored and decided to wander off and therefore did not come across this annex. The Duke said angrily that there was no need to linger here and ordered them to go back. Ophelia noticed how annoyed Sylvester was, but she still dared to ask who was depicted in the picture. The Duke looked angrily at his wife, and she, gathering her spirits, said that probably his mother was depicted in the picture, which is why Sylvester so carefully hid this place from prying eyes. Sylvester did not expect that Ophelia would dare to ask him about such personal things, so he said that it was none of her business. But she replied that she was his wife and had the right to ask about it. Then the Duke, unable to control his own emotions, grabbed his wife by the shoulders and said through his teeth that Ophelia had better not know about many things. His eyes seemed to burn through her. Sylvester added that Ophelia should not even think of digging into this topic further, and asked if everything was clear to her. Never since her rebirth had the girl seen Sylvester so angry. Then, as if coming to his senses, Sylvester let go of the Duchess's shoulders and, turning around, went down the stairs. He yelled for her to get out of here and never come here again. Ophelia was simply shocked by the Duke's behavior, so straightening her shoulders, she thought that she had never seen him so angry in her life. Previously, Sylvester did not care about everything that happened around him. Ophelia was so engrossed in her thoughts that when she began to descend, she stumbled, and only realized it when she began to fly down. She was so scared that she closed her eyes. Meanwhile, Sylvester was waiting for her downstairs. But hearing some rustling, he turned his head and saw that his wife was flying down. The Duke immediately ran to meet her to somehow help her. The Duke ran to the edge of the stairs just as Ophelia landed squarely on top of him. Lying under Ophelia, the Duke asked how she was feeling. The girl guiltily replied that everything was fine. Already when Ophelia moved away from the shock, she realized that she was lying directly on top of her husband and her fingers were resting on his chest. She was so ashamed that she immediately blushed from head to toe. Ophelia immediately began to get up and apologize to the Duke for falling on him, explaining that she had tripped and could not cope with coordination. The Duke dryly replied that she would forget about everything. The Duke also began to rise. Ophelia was so embarrassed that she thanked her husband for picking her up and explained that she didn't want it to happen like that because everything happened just like lightning. The Duke guiltily explained that it was a little awkward for him to talk to her because she was sitting on him, and Ophelia, even more ashamed, asked for forgiveness and began to rise to her feet. When they both got up, they turned away from each other because they felt very uncomfortable. The first to break the silence was the Duke, who said that the main thing was that Ophelia remained unharmed. Out of the corner of her eye, Ophelia noticed that a blush appeared on the Duke's face as well, and she could not understand what was happening to him and why he was so embarrassed, because it was completely unlike him. After the walk, Ophelia was in such a state that she did not want to see anyone, so she returned to her room and collapsed on the bed. Confused, the maid asked if her mistress was all right. The young girl buried her face in the pillows and did not want to talk to anyone, but answered that it was all right, so that Irene would detach herself from her and leave her alone. Ophelia couldn't get Sylvester's reaction out of her head after her fall. She thought that even a hopeless teenager would not react so openly to a young girl, so even she felt uncomfortable. Ophelia knew that the Duke could have brushed her off as usual, so she wondered why he was acting so strange. It was not like the cold and cynical Sylvester. Ophelia thought that if he continued in the same spirit, their feelings would become so entangled that they would not even be able to separate. And this was not part of her plans at all. Ophelia understood that if she stayed with the thief, the plot would become so confused that it would be extremely difficult to predict the future. And her plans for a happy life in a country house will be completely destroyed. Ophelia asked the maid if she had guessed correctly that her house arrest was due to end next week. The maid, after thinking, answered that Ophelia was completely right. Then the young lady stood up and declared emphatically that Irene must prepare for their departure. At that moment, Ophelia had already figured out what next steps she should take to implement her plan. At that time, Sylvester was in his office. There was a whole pile of important documents on the table in front of him, and he, looking at them, was flying somewhere far away in his thoughts. Neil, the assistant, could see that his master was somewhat disorganized, so he asked him what was going on. The Duke came to his senses and realized that the assistant must have asked him about something, so he replied that it was all trifles. Sylvester asked the assistant if there had been any news from the second prince, since he had not given any signs of his existence for a long time. Neil replied that nothing had come from him yet. Neil noted that the prince must be busy fighting the monsters that had begun in the north of their country. Therefore, the prince is engaged in the destruction of monsters, which he does not have enough of. The aide said that the prince must be enjoying his victories now. Sylvester replied that he must have asked the assistant to tell him immediately if there was any news from the prince. And then Sylvester suddenly asked Neil if he had noticed that his wife Ophelia hadn't visited her dark laboratory, where she used to go every day lately. Sylvester noticed this from the first day she returned home in that bad weather, but he thought that his wife would go there soon, but it never happened. The Duke's assistant also noticed this strange pattern and fully agreed with his master. And then he asked the Duke if it was ugly, because the Duke was constantly dissatisfied with her trips there. Sylvester said that this does not give him peace, because he does not know the real reason why his wife stopped going there. She is quite capricious, and maybe this is another prank of hers. The Duke noted that if Ophelia was trying to distract him to do something terrible with her dark magic, even he would have a hard time stopping her madness. Neil, after thinking, said that in that case, the Duke could easily take advantage of such an opportunity and banish Ophelia forever. and then he asked Sylvester what exactly he didn't like. Sylvester pondered the words of the assistant, and then said that he does not recognize his wife lately, and it even makes him feel creepy sometimes. After all, Opilia had never let Sylvester near her before, and now it suddenly changed. Sylvester had the impression that his wife had been struck by lightning. Sylvester remembered the words of Opilia, who said that she was his wife, and said aloud that perhaps she really had been struck by lightning when she had been walking in the rain for several days. Sylvester said that he just had to find out what was going on with Opilia, and they had to prepare for her sudden prank so that she wouldn't catch them off guard. The assistant noticed that his master was lost in his thoughts again and decided not to disturb him. The Duke, meanwhile, made up his mind that he must remain calm lest it cost him. Remembering their last meeting in the North Annex, Sylvester decided that it was better not to worry about such small things, especially when it concerned his Opilia. The Duke firmly said that he himself must decide what belongs to him and what he must get rid of forever, and no one can change his mind and somehow influence his decision. Sylvester mused that he had put a lot of effort into not being there, but the Crown Prince's gaze, which had only been focused on Flur, had been somewhat distracted lately. Sylvester didn't care exactly why this happened. The main thing for him was to find a reason for the Crown Prince to lose his vigilance and allow himself to make a few mistakes. As soon as public opinion about the Crown Prince reached its bottom, Sylvester planned to immediately put the second prince, who was somewhere in the shadows, on the throne. Sylvester was convinced that he needed to make the second prince emperor at any cost, and only then will the Duke be able to achieve his cherished goal. Dressed in black cloaks to hide her appearance, Opilia and her maid Irene set out for the city. The maid tried all the way to find out from the landlady why they were coming here. Irene noted that this alley looks dangerous enough for her to even look at it. But Opilia replied that the maid had nothing to fear because Opilia was next to her. The maid replied that Opilia was a very fragile girl. Opilia thought that people must have started to forget that she was a dark witch, when in fact Opilia relied on a secret escort. Opilia knew that people tried to avoid dark wizards and not contact them, although dark magic had many useful aspects, which only needed to be used correctly. Therefore, the girl decided that she would need to somehow learn to protect herself, and for this, she should learn dark magic. No matter how much she wanted to do it, it was vitally necessary for self-defense. Examining the surrounding buildings, the maid said that the nearby building had the green canopy Opilia had spoken of. When the Duchess looked at the building, she said that this is where they needed to be. Entering the room, Opilia found it difficult to breathe, because the room had such a terrible stench that she immediately understood that it was a rather difficult place. A stout man came out to meet them, who grumbled displeasedly for them to get away because nothing was for sale here. A black cat ran after the man. The maid yelled at the man that he allowed himself to talk so rudely he didn't even know who was standing in front of him, and told him to talk more politely with her lady. The kitten climbed onto the table and began to lick its paws. It had a pink bow around its neck, and the Duchess remarked that the animal was quite cute, unlike its unfriendly owner, who was definitely not happy with them. The man shouted that he didn't care who was standing in front of him, because neither princesses nor duchesses were waiting here, so he advised the girls to get out of his building immediately. But Opilia did not even think of going away, because she found this underground bench with such difficulty. Therefore, she boldly looked into the eyes of a formidable man and declared that it is illegal to sell monster meat. Opilia added that of course everyone turns a blind eye to the fact that monsters are eaten on the battlefield after defeating them in a fair fight, but it is completely illegal to sell meat in your own shop. Therefore, Opilia noted that if she reported her husband's illegal trade to the Imperial Guard, he would face more than 15 years in prison. Opilia looked at the man and noticed how drops of cold sweat appeared on his forehead. It was obvious that the man was getting nervous, so she asked him if he was okay with it. But the man shouted, asking if this girl had any proof of what she was talking about, because empty threats would not work against him, so he advised them to get away once more. Opilia decided to take the trump card out of her sleeve and tell the man who exactly he was dealing with, because she saw that empty words would not reach him, so she took off her hood. The man looked at the young woman with long silver hair in surprise, and asked her who she was. Opilia said in surprise that only a blind person could not understand who was really standing in front of him. Opilia said that the denizens of the dark corners know her face well, because she is the wife of Sylvester Resson, the Lord of the Dark Corners. And besides, she is a famous dark mage. Introducing herself, Opilia asked her husband not to threaten her anymore, because she came here simply to buy a fresh piece of monster meat. Her maid nearly fainted from these words. She asked Opilia in fear what she was going to do with the monster's meat. Irene suspected that the landlady had taken up dark magic again, and Opilia, smiling, replied that it would be a gift for a special gourmet and connoisseur of this type of food. Irene decided not to ask Opilia anything more, and just remained silent. In the dining room of the imperial palace, the crown prince sat down to dine opposite Fleur as usual. Today for lunch they had baked trout with a creamy sauce, Kalina's favorite dish. But the crown prince just poked at his plate with a fork and ate almost nothing. Fleur worried that something had happened to her lover and asked if he had enjoyed his dinner today. Kaelin hastened to answer that everything was fine with the food, and it was quite tasty. Fleur still couldn't figure out where her lover's appetite had gone, because the crown prince had never had a problem with it before. While walking in the fresh air after dinner, Fleur reflected on the fact that lately the crown prince had lost his appetite altogether and was always thinking about something without paying attention to Fleur. Fleur pondered the reason for the crown prince's strange behavior and mentally asked herself if her passionate hugs, which she tries to give him every day, are not helping him. Fleur was currently concerned about the crown prince's condition and was pondering how she could help him. The girl remembered all their last meetings and asked herself what was wrong. On the way, Fleur met the crown prince's assistant, Liana, who was holding some correspondence in his hands. Lian asked Fleur where she was going, and she explained that she was just taking a walk. Lian suggested that Fleur call an escort for her, but the girl objected, saying that there was no need for it. Fleur explained that she can easily handle it herself, because everyone is busy with their own affairs. Fleur's gaze rested on the letter that Lian was holding so carefully in her hands, and she carefully examined the seal that was visible on the envelope. The girl could not believe that she knew who this seal belonged to. Lian replied that if Fleur insisted on walking alone he wouldn't mind and asked her to be careful. Then the assistant went to the crown prince. But Fleur didn't hear Liana's words anymore, because she was shocked by what she saw in the envelope. After all, this seal was the personal seal of the Reason family, and it gave her goosebumps. The man listened attentively to Opilia and still gave his final word that no matter how much she tried to threaten him, her threats did not work on him, so he should refuse the lady's request. Opilia smiled and hastily took out a purse with money from her pocket. She demonstratively rattled it in front of the surprised man and threw the wallet on the table. Opilia said that he was insulting her, thinking that she wanted to get monster meat with just threats, and pointing to her wallet, asked the shocked man if that would be enough. The man had never seen so much money in his life, so he asked if she wanted to pay too much for a piece of meat. Opilia confidently answered that the price is determined by the buyer. And then Opilia mysteriously said that she would be interested to know about the stories that circulate among the traders. In fact, merchants were a kind of unofficial information guild. In addition, Opilia knew that Fleur in the original plot bought monster meat for Kaelin here, and often gathered information from merchants to be aware of all the affairs of the empire. So Opilia thought that Sylvester certainly had a lot more information with his information guild, and she wouldn't mind having her own personal informant either. The man pondered over Ophilia's proposal for a long time, and the money glistening on the table still prevailed, so he extended his hand to her in a friendly way and offered to call him Joseph. Then Opilia asked if he would sell her monster meat, and Joseph, smiling, replied that he would get the best piece for the lady and asked how he could address her. Joseph politely pointed out that if he continued to call her simply Madam, it would arouse suspicion among his customers. Therefore, he suggested that the girl come up with a nickname for herself. This caused some stupor in Opilia. She began to ponder his proposal. The man remarked that if it was inconvenient, he could just call her Madam. Opilia thought Joseph's proposal was quite thoughtful, so she told him to call her Yu Jin. That was her name in her past life, and she could not think of anything else at that moment. Joseph noted that Yu Jin was a rather unusual nickname, even for their area, and asked when she planned to proceed with her plan. Opilia replied that very soon. Opilia informed Joseph that this girl would come instead of her, and pointed her finger at the maid, who at that time was stroking the cat. Iring almost died of fear when she heard this from the landlady. The man suspiciously asked if this young lady would cope with such a responsible mission, and Opilia assured that she completely trusts this girl, so Joseph has nothing to worry about. Joseph asked to wait and went to the closet. Meanwhile, Irene, with tears in her eyes, began to explain to Opilia that she could not go for it, because she was very afraid of walking through dark alleys. The maid began to sob and said that she could easily be kidnapped in such godforsaken places, and asked Opilia to beat her to death rather than send monsters for meat. Opilia could see that the maid was very afraid, so she took her by the shoulders and asked if Irene could go for it if Opilia tripled her salary. Opilia guessed how she could influence Irene's decision. In her mind, Irene had already calculated how much she would receive in a month, so this offer looked quite tempting, and the maid replied that she agreed. Opilia rejoiced and praised her for the right decision. While the girls were waiting, a young man came out to them, apologizing and saying that there was nothing at the moment and that they would have to wait a little longer to receive their order. Opilia replied that there was nothing wrong and they would wait a little. At this time, the maid thought that Opilia had changed, because before she would not even want to hear it, that she would have to wait for something. Irene dreamed that if she remained Ophilia's maid, she would very soon become the main servant in the Reason family, save a lot of money, and definitely successfully marry some handsome man. This was her cherished dream for the maid, and she decided to stay close to Opilia at all costs in order to make it come true as soon as possible. Because it is thanks to this powerful lady that Irene will be able to achieve this. The Opilia that Irene knew before was a real demon, and the current Opilia was a bright angel. Meanwhile, Opilia offered Irene a cup of tea when the opportunity arose. Irene could not believe that she was treated so well, so she hugged Opilia and said that she would gladly go with her not only to a cup of tea, but also to the end of the world. And they went to a coffee shop together. Recently, the crown prince was constantly in his thoughts, and not only Flur, but also everyone around him noticed it. Everyone was worried about Kalin, but did not know how to help him in this. The crown prince's aide looked carefully at his highness and noticed that the prince had been somewhat worried lately. Then the crown prince emotionally replied that it was not surprising. When the crown prince received a letter from Opilia, which said that if she came to the palace, she would bring something very important with her. And since then, the prince constantly thought about it. Kalin hoped Opilia would bring a letter from his mother with her. The prince immediately decided that in case of deception on the part of the Duchess of Resin, he would arrange for her something that would almost appear. Fleur was also troubled by the letter with the seal of the Reason family and did not understand why she still had to date Opilia if Kalin had promised her never to see the witch again. And while Fleur was thinking about how to prevent the meeting of the crown prince with Opilia, Opilia herself and her maid merrily drank tea, waiting for a fresh portion of monster meat from Joseph. When His Highness was informed that Duchess Opilia Reason had arrived, he immediately set out to meet her. The crown prince's only thought was what she was up to this time. Beautifully dressed Opilia was already waiting for the prince in the living room. He, looking at the beauty, firmly decided that no matter what it cost him, he would be steadfast and not allow her to deceive him. As soon as Opilia saw the prince, she immediately greeted him. She asked how he was feeling lately and if he missed her. The prince mentally acknowledged that this woman was behaving as usual. The crown prince resolutely sat down opposite Opilia and asked what had brought her this time. He warned that if her visit was not connected with a letter from his mother, then she could get out of here immediately. Opilia tried to keep a calm expression on her face, and mentally noted that this ignoramus was much worse than Sylvester. Therefore, the girl thought that she was also lucky with legal men. Opilia reassured herself that for her happy future she needs to suffer a little and crawled behind the box with a special gift for the prince. Kalin asked impatiently what was there. Opilia said politely that she had brought His Highness something he would like much more than a letter from his mother, and handed him the mysterious box. The crown prince carefully examined the casket and noticed traces of blood on it. He felt creepy, because he could not even imagine what she had brought him as a gift. Kalin's mood immediately deteriorated, and he shouted at Opilia, asking her if she had lost her mind at times, because he always wondered when her roof would finally come off. The crown prince angrily exclaimed, how could she even think of bringing part of a corpse with her to the imperial palace? He felt both disgusting and creepy at the same time when he imagined what could be there. But Opilia calmly offered to open the casket to the crown prince, and then he himself would be able to understand what was there. And even though it was a corpse, Opilia was sure that the prince should like it. The crown prince was disgusted to even touch the chest, but still curiosity prevailed, and he wanted to know what Opilia was capable of. When the prince opened the chest, he saw a fresh piece of monster meat. The crown prince immediately remembered his military days. In that distant period, His Highness was addicted to this taste and ate monster meat at least once a week. But since Kalin got to the imperial palace, of course, this forbidden delicacy was not in the kitchen. and therefore he did not taste this incredible taste for 2 whole years. The crown prince shouted, asking Opilia if she had lost her mind, because the distribution of monster meat was strictly prohibited by the laws of their empire, and she had thought of bringing the meat into the palace. Opilia calmly replied that it should not worry her. Kaelin was drooling at just one look at the juicy meat. The prince knew that if he reported this to the royal guards, they would immediately destroy him. His Highness so wanted to remember what this meat tasted like, that he decided that if he was caught with even this, then he could put all the blame on the crazy dark witch, Opilia. The prince quickly called the maid and ordered her to remove it from his sight. The maid said she understood everything, but Kaelin suddenly added that she should not throw away the meat in any case, but take it to the kitchen. Opilia noticed that the prince looked quite happy. Kaelin quickly replied that it all just seemed to her, and if that's all, then she can leave his palace right away. Opilia remarked that one should not be so rude to the one who had brought such a valuable gift for him. But the crown prince was determined to finish the conversation quickly. Therefore, Kaelin confidently said that he should treat Opilia only in this way. Getting up, he began to count the time left for the Duchess to meet, and when the count stopped at 2, she asked to wait. Opilia said she knew one guild. This guild is obviously not as influential as her husband's, but it is also worth noting. The prince immediately stopped his counting and began to listen carefully to the Duchess. Opilia said that in this guild, hired assassins from all over the world gather and share valuable information with each other. So it would be nice if someone had access to it. Opilia told the prince that, as he knew, it was not wise to make any decisions without sufficient information. After all, in their time, information was more valuable than life. The crown prince knew that the Duchess was telling the truth, as he had recently experienced it himself when he made a hasty decision, without having enough information about the situation. Kaelin knew that the second prince and Duke Resen were together. And since Resen was the head of the Information Guild, their position in the political arena was much stronger than that of Kaelin himself. Opilia saw how her information got into the top 10, so she noted that this guild is very careful, and not everyone can enter, so the prince will have to cooperate with Opilia. The crown prince looked at the young woman and asked why she would take him to such a dangerous place. Opilia replied with a smile because she really likes Kaelin. The crown prince looked at this woman and decided that she had lost all shame in speaking to his face about her sympathy. But this idea with the Information Guild was very tempting. But before cooperating with this cunning woman, the crown prince decided to dot all the I's. Therefore, he shouted that Opilia was the real traitor to Sylvester Resen. Looking into Ophilia's eyes, Kaelin said that he would never love her in any way in his life, and he could swear that he would never even think about it. Therefore, the prince immediately warned that the Duchess had no chance. Opilia replied that he should not be so nervous because she did not tell him all this in order to win his heart. She didn't care even if he refused her help. She wanted the crown prince to make sure that Opilia could help her husband at any time, and if Ophilia's emotions were pushed, then you could do anything with her. Her plan was to inspire Kalina with exactly these thoughts and arouse his interest. Of course, she understood that this could interfere with Sylvester, and since he himself ordered to enlist the support of the prince, then let him have it. Opilia remarked that you shouldn't wish the best to the one you love. The crown prince looked at the young woman and wondered how such thoughts could arise in her head. The crown prince knew that Opilia was the kind of woman who could do terrible things and not feel any guilt at all. Therefore, he remarked aloud that she was simply abnormal. Opilia also smiled back at the crown prince and said she was the best thief in the world. At that moment, she truly believed that she had become a completely shameless thief. As soon as Opilia came to the coachman was glad that his lady was finally back, and asked if they would be leaving at once. Opilia said she needed to rest a little to begin with. Once in the carriage, Opilia leaned back on the seat and said that she was very tired today, because this day had taken all her strength. But she still managed to attract the attention of the crown prince. Opilia understood that Kaelin's support could interfere with her husband Sylvester, and then she wondered who this Sylvester really was. Everyone knew him as the greatest thief in human history. From the original plot, the girl knew that it was better not to anger Sylvester. Therefore, no one dared to touch the Duke of Resen, except Opilia herself, who did not pay any attention to it. Then the girl began to think how the real Opilia brought Sylvester to death. She wondered if Opilia had achieved this through dark magic, or if she had some other ability that Opilia was unaware of. Ophelina was so lost in her thoughts that they did not notice how a woman approached the carriage. The Duchess came to her senses only when there was a knock at the carriage door, and she looked out to see who was there. But what Opilia saw near the carriage knocked the ground out from under her feet, because she did not expect that Fleur herself would come up to her and greet Opilia as politely as if nothing had happened between them. In Ophelia's head, thoughts immediately began to race, why Fleur approached her. After all, only recently she cried to Kaelin that Opilia was insulting her. Fleur explained that she saw the carriage and decided to say hello. Fleur told Opilia that she had come to apologize for being rude during their last meeting, and then she asked if Duchess Reason had a moment to chat alone. At first Opilia thought of teaching Fleur before anyone could see or just sending her away, but Fleur looked at Opilia with such pitiful eyes that the Duchess agreed anyway and invited her into the carriage. Opilia herself did not understand how Fleur was already sitting in the carriage in front of her. The girl looked at the Duchess rather bravely and apologized for being rather rude to Opilia last time. Fleur apologized again, and Opilia remarked that it was very good that Fleur understood this. But then Opilia asked if it wasn't better for them to just avoid each other and try not to see each other at all. Opilia added that if His Highness found out about their meeting, he would be angry again and Opilia would be punished for it. Fleur swore that Kaelin would never find out about this and Opilia could rest easy. Opilia didn't know if she could trust this woman, who was also smiling at the last meeting, and then she reported everything to the Crown Prince, causing him to summon Opilia to the palace. Fleur assured that the Crown Prince would definitely listen to her. Opilia watched as this girl smiled sweetly in her face, and she shamelessly lied and then twisted all the facts. Opilia decided that in fact there was no urgent reason for their meeting, and therefore thought that it was worth getting rid of Fleur as soon as possible and finally go home. Opilia said that she would also like to meet with Fleur, and if that's all Fleur wanted to tell her, then Opilia thanks her for the interview and doesn't dare delay Fleur anymore, hinting to the girl that it's time to get out of here. Fleur said that the Duchess has changed a lot lately and she has heard it from many people, so Fleur would like to tell Opilia that she is preparing to divorce Earl William. And then she added that after the divorce, Fleur had already promised to marry His Highness and would be very happy to see Opilia at her wedding, whom she asked to bless their marriage. Fleur wanted to share her story and began to say that she was born into a family of unknown traders. They did not have a title, but they lived fairly well because of a successful trading business. Fleur was always praised and admired for her beautiful appearance, calling her an angel. She did not even suspect that at one moment all this perfect life of hers could fall apart. One day, during a trading expedition, the ship on which the father sailed sank along with all their wealth. Therefore, everything disappeared in one moment, and the girl was left without food. Fleur's house suddenly filled with horrible things. The girl constantly had to inhale the smell of alcohol, shudder from loud arguments and crying, and be horrified by angry faces. Life is a rather unpredictable thing, and Fleur understood this from her own experience. In one day, she ceased to be an angel, both for her peers and for distant relatives. It was just terrible, because in one night they lost everything they had earned with so much hard work and plunged into a whole pile of debt, from which it seemed impossible to ever get out. It seemed as if everyone around young Fleur was just disgusted that she was living in such terrible conditions. But one day an elderly nobleman came to their estate. This old man was persuading Fleur to marry him. And although it looked like a pretty terrifying prospect, Fleur's life was already a living hell, so she decided to accept the Duke's offer. Fleur was now an angel again, and her husband soon paid off all her debts. Then she began to live in a golden cage, and everyone admired her status and her cozy estate, which she arranged at her discretion. Being the wife of a noble earl, Fleur constantly wondered if she was really happy. That was until she found an injured young man in her garden and, as if in a trance, brought him into the house. The young man's hair shone like gold, and she had never seen such handsome young men. She was constantly bothered by the question of why exactly he lost consciousness in her garden. Fleur spent all her free time at the Crown Prince's bedside, trying to get him back on his feet as quickly as possible. At that time, she understood that this was her destiny. It turned out that this young man was the Crown Prince, and as a sign of gratitude to the girl for saving him, he knelt down and said that it was she who saved him from death. Even then, the Crown Prince gave her a wedding ring and offered to marry him. Kaelin constantly reminded that Fleur is his savior, and Fleur understood that she could not live without him. Then Fleur came to the conclusion that all the trials that she went through in her life were not in vain, and, as a reward, she received such a man given to her by fate itself. Fleur decided that she was special and unique, and being a commoner as she was in childhood, and a countess as she was in her youth, was not enough for her. After all, she wanted to become an empress. Fleur was confident in her abilities until one day Opilia Resson appeared. Everyone admired her incredible beauty, comparing her to a snow-white angel who descended from heaven. Ophelia's noble figure and striking beauty radiated a sense of freedom, and that day Fleur thought that she would never in her life defeat this incredible beauty, with whom she was advised not to associate. But then Fleur calmed down, due to the fact that Opilia turned out to be a cruel thief, who, on top of that, tried to constantly humiliate Fleur. Protecting his beloved, Kaelin became even closer to her. Everyone considered Opilia to be a cunning and lying woman, so Fleur decided that it would be easy for her to deal with her rival due to the fact that the crown prince constantly protected her from Ophelia's attacks. The more Opilia mocked Fleur, the more zealously the crown prince defended her. Kaelin constantly told his beloved that she endured so much humiliation for his sake. The crown prince tried to protect Fleur as much as possible, and shouted that Opilia Reason should get out of his sight and never appear in his life again, because the mere sight of her sickened him. Opilia constantly tried to reach the crown prince and begged him not to drive her out of the palace. But Kaelin was adamant in his decision and always stayed with Fleur. Fleur decided that no matter how beautiful Opilia Reason was, Kaelin's love would always belong to her alone, and Countess Reason would never defeat Fleur in the fight for the crown prince's heart. Fleur was sure that all these trials were sent to her by God only so that one day she would shine and be happy in Kaelin's arms. And Fleur was convinced that she would succeed in defeating Opilia. Fleur now put her innocent smile back on her face and asked Opilia if she would come to their wedding. Fleur thought to herself that on that particular day, Opilia would help Fleur shine in her full beauty. Fleur expected that as soon as Opilia heard about the marriage, she would immediately start screaming as she had before, so she waited for her reaction and was ready to use this opportunity to her advantage. And Opilia, after thinking a little, answered that it really deserved her blessing, and she would gladly attend such a solemn event in the life of Fleur from the crown prince. Opilia remarked that if that was all Fleur wanted to tell her, she apologized for being in such a hurry. Therefore Fleur, who still could not get over the shock, got out of the carriage. Fleur stood for a long time in a stupor, watching as Ophilia's carriage drove away from the palace. She couldn't believe that after the news of her marriage to the crown prince, Opilia reacted so calmly. Alone in the carriage, Opilia is also angry with herself for not daring to hit Fleur, because now the girl can understand that Opilia is not capable of anything. Opilia understood that Fleur was trying to provoke her, and as soon as the Duchess raised her hand to her, Fleur would immediately run to complain to the crown prince, and Opilia would not have gotten away with it that way. In the original plot, Fleur was so kind and naive that she looked like a real angel. But in fact, the characters were so different that Ophelia's head hurt. After such stressful events for today, Opilia only dreamed of being in her room as soon as possible and finally resting. Kucher reported that they had arrived at the estate. But as soon as the carriage door opened, Opilia saw Sylvester standing in front of her, who held out his hand to help her get out. He smiled and said that she came back quite late today. Leaving the carriage, Opilia asked if Irina had told Sylvester that she had gone to meet the prince today. Sylvester replied that Opilia had been gone too long anyway. Holding his wife's hand, Sylvester asked her if everything went well at the meeting. Opilia wondered why he was asking about this, and the Duke explained that Ophelia's appearance was, to put it mildly, not very good. Then Opilia began to consider whether she should tell her husband about everything, because he would certainly not be displeased with her actions. Therefore, she did not even know what to say to Sylvester about the meeting. Nevertheless, Opilia said that the meeting with the crown prince went quite well, and she was in a good mood. But suddenly, Countess Fleur persistently wanted to get into Ophelia's carriage. Opilia said that Fleur had announced her divorce from Earl Williams and her plans to marry the crown prince. And what's more, Fleur invited Opilia herself to this solemn event. Sylvester listened carefully and asked if Opilia had hit Countess Fleur. Opilia said no, although she really wanted to slap her. Sylvester then praised his wife for holding back. Sylvester said thoughtfully that by all accounts, Fleur had declared war on Opilia, and now the wife should be extremely careful when communicating, and especially taking any actions aimed at Fleur. Ophelia asked if Sylvester knew Fleur's true colors. Herzog said that he had a bad feeling, and the spy had never let him down. And therefore for Sylvester, it was expected. Ophelia thought that if you remember the original plot, Fleur was not one of the weak ones, because she held her own even when Ophelia humiliated her. So Countess Fleur possessed an impressive determination. Ophelia's decisive actions required courage and perseverance. Now Ophelia thought about the fact that it is impossible not to pay attention to such a strong rival, and in the future she should be extremely careful with her. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Fleur knew how to achieve her goal, because she managed to make the crown prince fall in love with her. And not even a couple of months passed before they planned their wedding. Already now Ophelia seems to have opened her eyes to sweet and weak Fleur. She was glad that Sylvester was on her side. So Ophelia had to disabuse Calin of the misconception about his bride. While Theo stayed at the estate of the Resin family, he spent all his free time in training. He was good at wielding a sword and was happy to improve his skill every day. Ophelia often watched him through the window, but today she decided to visit the young man at his training. So taking a basket of goodies with her, she headed towards him. After a couple of minutes, a tablecloth with goodies was laid in front of the young man, and Ophelia asked if it was difficult for him to be in their estate. Theo was confused by such a question. The young man said that he did not even half deserve what was being given to him here, and now he was ashamed that he had refused this offer in the beginning. Theo thanked Ophelia for receiving him so kindly. Ophelia asked how his sword training was going, and Theo, embarrassed, said that his teacher often praised him, although he understood that he had to work hard and study hard. The young man also reported that last time the Duke came to training and watched them go through. It seemed to the boy that Sylvester liked the young man's skill and even accepted him. A satisfied smile appeared on Ophelia's face, and she decided that since Sylvester did not try to be cold with Theo, the Duke noticed his talent and accepted the boy. The young man saw that the lady was in a good mood. Then Ophelia suddenly asked if there was anything else the boy needed. Theo, thinking for a long time, decided to tell her after all. As soon as Ophelia heard this, she immediately rose to her feet and ran as fast as she could to her husband's office. On the way, she reflected on how she could not think of this herself before. During the conversation, Theo admitted that the teacher gave him a book that talked about modern techniques of martial arts, but he could not read it, because to his shame, he did not study it anywhere. So the Duchess decided to immediately fill this gap in the education of the young man and teach him at least to read, and for this, it was necessary to hire good teachers, and Sylvester's help was indispensable here. Without even knocking on the door, Ophelia immediately flew into the office, scaring the Duke's assistant, who even went back. Sylvester smiled and said that she hadn't come at him like that in a long time. Ophelia, catching her breath, replied that she would consider it a compliment. Approaching the Duke, Ophelia took his hand and looked into his eyes, and then she gently said that she needed money. Sylvester could not believe that finally his wife showed attention to him herself. He was looking at her fingers, which were gently hugging his hand. But Ophelia insisted that she needed the money immediately. Having put on her best dress and headdress, Ophelia was already hurrying down the street. But suddenly she was overtaken by Sylvester, who was also dressed in a festive way, which surprised Ophelia. The mood of the Duke was quite good. He told his wife that it had been a long time since he had visited such places on personal business, so he suggested that they go on together. Ophelia looked at this handsome man and thought that now their walk was very similar to a romantic date. All the more so, as her feelings suggested that something interesting was waiting for her ahead.